Hi everyone, welcome back to Mr. Night Scare's story. Before you drift off, let me know in the comments where you're listening from if you're enjoying the stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe now. Let's relax and jump into tonight's case. Story 1. The Whispering Shadows. A chilling mystery that still haunts Black Hollow. The night of November 14th, 1998 was like any other in Black Hollow, Pennsylvania. Cold, quiet, and draped in fog. It was the kind of night where even the wind didn't dare to howl. At 12:34 a.m., a desperate call came through to 911. Operator, Black Hollow Emergency Services. What's your emergency? Caller, whispering, panicked. He's coming. He's here. Oh God, I can see him. Operator, ma'am, please stay calm. Who is coming? Can you give me your location? The woman's breathing was erratic. There was a rustling sound, like movement in the dark. Then, barely audible, caller. He doesn't have a face. A sharp gasp, a muffled scream, then silence. When officers traced the call, it led them to an abandoned 19th century mansion, known to the locals as Holloway Manor. The house had been empty for years, left to rot after the last of the Holloway family disappeared without a trace in 1952. The responding officers found no sign of the caller, no signs of a struggle, no blood, no footprints except for one single footprint, unnaturally large and twisted as if the foot had been bent at an impossible angle. And on the walls of the mansion, something had been scratched into the wood with what looked like fingernails. Don't listen to the whispers. The woman on the call was never identified. No missing person reports matched her voice, and soon the case went cold. But this was not the first disappearance tied to Holloway Manor. The mysterious call in 1998 was just one in a long list of unexplained vanishings linked to Holloway Manor. The house was cursed, the locals whispered. Something lived in the walls, waiting. Between 1989 and 1997, 5 people disappeared near the estate. 1. Daniel Crest, 1989. Daniel Crest, a local journalist, had been investigating Holloway Manor for a piece on America's most haunted places. He was a skeptic, always searching for logical explanations behind ghost stories. On October 3, 1989, he told his editor he was going inside the house for an overnight stay. He never returned. His car was found parked outside the manor, keys still in the ignition. His notebook was on the passenger seat, open to his final entry. Something in the walls is watching. His body was never found. 2. Susan Wallace, 1992. In 1992, 17-year-old Susan Wallace and 3 friends dared each other to spend the night in Holloway Manor. They snuck in just before midnight. By morning, only 3 of them came back. Susan was never seen again. Her friends refused to speak about what had happened. But one of them, years later, during a drunken confession, muttered she heard the whispers. When asked what that meant, he shook his head and whispered. They were inside her head. 3. Officer James Holloway, 1995. Officer James Holloway was a distant relative of the Holloway family. He'd grown up hearing stories about the estate but never believed in the legends. On April 12, 1995, he responded to a trespassing call at the manor. He radioed his partner upon arrival. Then, minutes later, his last transmission came through, a single static-filled word, "Run." By the time backup arrived, the house was empty. His patrol car was still running. His gun was found on the front steps, 1 bullet fired. He was never seen again. 4. Paul Garrett, 1997. Private investigator Paul Garrett was hired by Officer Holloway's family to find out what happened. He vanished 2 weeks later. The only clue left behind? Cassette recorder, found just outside the house. The tape contained 45 minutes of silence, except for the last few seconds. A deep, inhuman whisper hissed, "Leave now." Paul was never found. 5. The anonymous 911 caller, 1998. And then, in 1998, came the anonymous woman's call. The one who whispered in terror, "He doesn't have a face." She was never found. In 2003, a group of urban explorers sneaked into Holloway Manor with a VHS camera. They wanted to film a documentary about the house and its mysteries. The footage they recorded was later recovered by police. What it contained was so disturbing that even seasoned officers refused to discuss it. The video showed the group exploring the house, laughing, joking. The place was falling apart. Rotten floorboards, peeling wallpaper, furniture covered in white sheets. Then, at 12:32 a.m., something changed. A low whispering sound filled the air. None of the explorers seemed to hear it except one. A girl named Emily Carter. "Guys, do you hear that?" The others didn't, but the camera did. As the minutes passed, the whispers grew louder. The footage became glitchy. The group started panicking. Then someone screamed. The camera dropped to the floor. Footsteps pounded. A male voice shouted, "Run! Run!" The last clear image on the tape was of a tall, shadowy figure at the end of the hallway. Its face was smooth and featureless, as if someone had erased it. Then the camera cut to black. Of the 5 explorers, only one survived, Emily Carter. She was found wandering the woods, barefoot, shaking. She refused to speak for months. When she finally did, she whispered, "It's not a ghost. It's something else. Something older. Lives." In 2005, Holloway Manor mysteriously burned to the ground. The cause was never determined. The ruins still stand, covered in vines and graffiti that warns, "Don't listen to the whispers." Most of Black Hollow has moved on. But some say, if you visit the ruins at midnight, you can still hear the whispers calling you inside. Epilogue. A new disappearance? In 2023, podcaster Jake Reynolds decided to investigate the case. He live-streamed his trip to the ruins. His final words before the stream cut out, "Guys, there's someone here. He's standing in the doorway. No eyes. No." The screen went black. Jake Reynolds has never been seen again. The legend of the Whispering Shadows lives on. Story number 2. The Vanishing Road. An unsolved American crime that still haunts travelers. On the night of September 17, 2012, Ethan Walker, a 26-year-old photographer, was driving along Route 117, a desolate highway cutting through the dense forests of Montana. He was heading home from a camping trip, recording voice memos about the eerie beauty of the road. The final recording on his phone, found days later, would send shivers down the spine of even the most skeptical investigators. "I swear the road is changing. I've passed the same mile marker twice now. Something's wrong." There's silence. Then, a deep, guttural whisper. "Keep driving." The recording ends. Ethan's car was found 3 days later, parked neatly on the side of Route 117. The keys were in the ignition. His wallet and phone were inside. But Ethan was gone. No footprints. No signs of struggle. Just an open car door leading into the dark woods. And he wasn't the first to vanish on that road. Chapter 1. The Road That Eats People. Route 117 was built in 1954, cutting through Blackwood National Forest. It was supposed to be a shortcut between 2 small towns, Ash Hollow and Red Pines. But by the 1970s, people began whispering about the vanishing road. Travelers, truckers, even local police. People had gone missing without a trace while driving alone at night. Over the decades, more than 30 disappearances were linked to Route 117. The pattern was always the same. The driver was alone. The last communication was confused or panicked. The car was always found abandoned, with no sign of a struggle. No bodies were ever recovered. Some of the most chilling disappearances included: 1. Officer Brian Douglas, 1983. In 1983, State Trooper Brian Douglas was sent to investigate reports of a stalled vehicle on Route 117. He radioed dispatch at 11:42 p.m. Just an empty car. No driver. "I'll check the woods." At 11:47 p.m., his final transmission came through. "What the hell? There's another car. But it's the same one. I just checked it. How is that?" Then, static. When backup arrived, Douglas' patrol car was parked by the road. His radio was still on. His flashlight lay on the ground, still switched on. He was never seen again. 2. Emma Lee, 1996. In 1996, Emma Lee, a 19-year-old college student, called her mother while driving home from Red Pines. "Mom, I think I'm lost. The road keeps looping. I see the same sign every few miles." Her mother told her to turn around. "I tried, but I'm still here." That was her last call. Her car was found a week later. The engine was running, but the driver's seat was empty. 3. The Call of the Dead, 2009. In 2009, truck driver Matthew Hayes made a distress call to his dispatcher. "I don't know where I am. The road's different. The sky looks wrong." He sounded distant, as if he were calling from somewhere far away. Then, in a flat, hollow voice, he said, "I have to go now. He's here." Click. His truck was found the next day. The cab was empty. The seatbelt was unbuckled. The doors were unlocked. But the strangest part? The driver's seat was warm, as if he had just been there. People who survived Route 117 at night reported strange occurrences. Time distortion. Travelers drove for hours but realized only minutes had passed. Repeating landmarks. Some claimed to see the same signposts or mile markers multiple times. The man in the fog, a shadowy figure, was sometimes spotted standing by the road, watching cars pass. One trucker, David Callahan, recalled seeing a second version of his own truck in the rearview mirror, with himself driving it. When he blinked, it was gone. In 2017, paranormal researcher Dr. Leonard Hensley set out to debunk the legends of Route 117. He mounted cameras on his dashboard and set off at midnight. His final transmission to his assistant was chilling. "The road, it's stretching. I can't see an end." Then, a whisper on the recording. "Keep driving." His car was found 3 days later. The footage was corrupted except for one frame, a blurred shadowy figure standing in the middle of the road. Dr. Hensley was never seen again. Chapter 5. The Theory of the Other Row. Some believe Route 117 is connected to something else, a place outside our reality, a rift between dimensions, a trap set by something inhuman, a road that doesn't always lead where you expect. Whatever the truth is, no bodies have ever been recovered. In 2023, YouTuber Kyle Summers decided to livestream his drive on Route 117. His audience watched in real time as he joked about the legend. Then, around 2:15 a.m., he fell silent. The chat flooded with messages. "Kyle, are you okay?" For 2 minutes, there was nothing but the sound of the engine and heavy breathing. Then a whisper barely audible. "He's in the back seat." The stream cut to black. Kyle's car was found 2 days later. The doors were open. The seat was still warm. But Kyle? Gone. And somewhere, deep in the endless dark of Route 117, the road keeps stretching, waiting for the next traveler, for the next whisper, for the next disappearance. Story number 3. The Girl Who Never Existed. An unsolved American mystery that still haunts investigators. On November 2nd, 1999, a young girl, around 7 years old, was found wandering the streets of Brooklyn, New York at 2:47 a.m. She was barefoot, wearing a white nightgown, and her arms were covered in strange symbols, drawn in what looked like charcoal or ink. A police officer, Detective James Holloway, spotted her and approached. "Hey, sweetie, are you lost? What's your name?" The girl stared at him, unblinking. Then she whispered, "I don't have a name. I'm not supposed to be here." Holloway took her to the station, assuming she was a runaway. But when they ran her fingerprints through the national database, nothing came up. No birth records, no missing person reports, no DNA matches. It was as if she had never existed. The girl was placed in Child Protective Services while authorities tried to figure out who she was. She refused to eat, only drinking water. She never slept, only sitting awake in bed. She spoke perfect English, but when asked where she was from, she only replied, "Nowhere." Psychologists tried to get her to open up, but she only gave strange, chilling responses. "I wasn't supposed to leave. The door wasn't locked this time. They'll come looking for me soon. Then 3 days later, she vanished. Not just from the foster home, from every record. Security footage showed that, at 3:13 a.m., the girl sat up in bed and walked toward the window. Then, the camera glitched for exactly 6 seconds. When the feed returned, the bed was empty. The window was still locked from the inside. She was gone. Police launched a citywide search, but there were no witnesses, no leads. Even stranger, every physical record of her vanished. The case files on her desk were blank. The fingerprints taken at the station were gone from the database. The security footage from the night she was found? Completely corrupted. It was as if she had never been there at all. Detective Holloway, the officer who had first found the girl, became obsessed. He searched for years, looking for similar cases. Then, in 2007, he received an anonymous package on his doorstep. Inside was a single, yellowed piece of paper. Written in small, uneven handwriting, it said, "The door was open again. Another one came through. Find her before they do." There was no return address, no fingerprints, just a single, black symbol drawn in the corner of the page. The same symbol that had been on the girl's arms. Holloway dug deeper and discovered something terrifying. Over the last 50 years, there were several cases of children appearing out of nowhere. No birth records, no families, no past. And in every case, the child vanished within days without a trace. Boston, 1972. A boy found in a subway tunnel, saying, "I got out, but I'm not safe." Seattle, 1985. A girl in a hospital waiting room, whispering, "They won't let me stay." Chicago, 1993. A child standing in the middle of the road, repeating, "The door wasn't locked." Each one disappeared, and in each case the records vanished too, as if they had never been there. On October 29, 2019, Detective Holloway, now retired, received one last call from a blocked number. A girl's voice, soft but clear. "You were the only one who listened." Holloway's hands shook. "Who are you?" he asked. The girl's response? "I'm not supposed to exist." Then a pause, a whisper. "But neither are they." The call cut out, and Detective Holloway disappeared that same night. In 2024, security footage at a New Orleans police station captured a barefoot girl in a white nightgown standing outside the entrance at 2:47 a.m. When an officer approached, she whispered. The door was open again. Then, just like before, the camera glitched, and she was gone. Who were these children? Where did they come from? And who or what is coming after them? Story number 4. The town that appears only once. An unsolved mystery that defies time. On August 7, 1987, at exactly 3:14 p.m., a truck driver named Harold Jensen was driving through rural West Virginia when he saw something he couldn't explain. A town. Small, quiet, old-fashioned, like something out of the 1950s. It wasn't on his map, and he was sure it wasn't there yesterday. Curious, he pulled into town. People were walking the streets, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. Children rode bicycles with big front wheels, and a man was selling milk in glass bottles. There were no cars, only horse-drawn carriages. And something else was strange. Everyone stopped to stare at him. Then, at the exact same moment, they all smiled. Harold parked his truck and stepped out. A woman approached him, dressed like she was from 1955, with curled hair and a long dress. "You made it just in time," she said, smiling. "For what?" Harold asked. "For the festival, of course." She gestured toward the center of town, where people were gathering. A brass band played cheerful music. Banners hung between lampposts, reading, "Welcome to Gray Haven." Harold had been through this part of the state dozens of times. There was no town called Gray Haven, but here it was, right in front of him. Harold walked into the local diner, hoping to ask for directions. As soon as he stepped inside, everyone turned to look at him. "Welcome back, Harold," the waitress smiled. Harold froze. "How do you know my name?" She laughed. "You always come back. Always." Harold had never been here before. He hurried out of the diner, feeling uneasy. Something was wrong. The people were too friendly. The town was too perfect. And when he looked back at the main street, everyone in town was standing still, watching him, smiling. Panicked, Harold ran back to his truck. He turned the key. The engine wouldn't start. The children on bicycles were circling his truck now. Smiling, a man tapped on his window. "You should stay for the festival." Harold slammed on the gas. The truck roared to life. He sped toward the town's exit, but when he reached the main road, it looped him back into town. No matter which street he turned down, he always ended up back in Grey Haven. The sky grew darker. The band kept playing, and the people of Grey Haven began to dance in the streets, laughing, singing, like a celebration that had been waiting just for him. Harold tried to call for help, but his radio only played old music. His phone had no signal. A man in a black suit approached. "It's time, Harold," he said. "Time for what?" Harold demanded. The man smiled. "For you to remember." Harold's head began to spin. Memories flooded back. Memories he didn't recognize, but somehow felt real. He had been here before. Not once, not twice, but many times. Every 30 years, Grey Haven appeared, and someone was always brought back. Someone who had been here before. Someone who had forgotten. "It's your turn, Harold," the man in the suit whispered. The crowd surrounded him. Hands reached for him. And then, darkness. Epilogue, the town that disappeared. The next morning, police found Harold's truck abandoned on the side of the highway. His wallet was still in the cab. His keys were in the ignition, but Harold Jensen was gone. There was no town where he claimed to have been. No Grey Haven. Just empty woods, like it had never existed. In 2024, a traveler in West Virginia posted a strange photo online. It showed a road sign, old and faded, deep in the woods. The sign read, "Welcome to Grey Haven. Festival starts soon." No town was marked on the map, but the traveler swore he could hear music. Story number 5. The House That Watches. An unsolved American mystery that no one survives. On March 4th, 1998, a young couple, David and Sarah Miller, moved into an old Victorian house in Blackwood, Pennsylvania. The house had been abandoned for over 30 years. No one knew why, but the price was unbelievably low, and the Millers couldn't resist. On their first night, as they were unpacking, Sarah found an old envelope taped to the inside of the bedroom closet. Inside was a single piece of paper with a warning. "You are being watched. Never look out the windows at night." They laughed it off. By the third night, they weren't laughing anymore. Chapter 1. The Eyes in the Dark. That night, at exactly 2:43 a.m., Sarah woke up. She had the strange feeling that someone was watching her. David was still asleep beside her. The room was silent. Then, a soft tap, tap, tap. She sat up. The sound was coming from the window. Slow, steady, like fingernails on glass. Heart pounding, she reached for the curtain. Then she remembered the letter's warning. "Never look out the windows at night." She held her breath. The tapping stopped. In the silence, a whisper came from outside. Just 2 words. "Come closer." Sarah did not sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, David told Sarah she must have been dreaming, but something felt wrong. Every window in the house had heavy curtains, and some were nailed shut. By who? That night, David decided to prove the warning was just a prank. At 2:43 a.m., he walked up to the window. Sarah begged him not to look, but David pulled back the curtain and froze. His face went pale. Sarah whispered, "What do you see?" David's lips trembled. Then he spoke 3 chilling words. "It saw me." David refused to say what he saw. The next night, at 2:43 a.m., Sarah woke up to find him standing at the window. The curtain was still closed, but he was whispering, "I see you too," over and over. Sarah pulled him away. His skin was ice cold, and his eyes weren't blinking. The next morning, David acted like nothing happened. But he was different, quieter, and every night he stood at the window. Sarah did research on the house. What she found made her blood run cold. In 1962, a family of 4 moved in. All vanished. In 1975, a man bought the house. Vanished after 6 months. In 1984, a woman rented it. Vanished in 1 week. No bodies, no clues, just gone, like they had never existed. And in every police report, there was always one final note. A neighbor reported seeing the victim standing at a window for several nights before their disappearance. Chapter 5, The Final Night. Sarah begged David to leave the house. He refused. He just kept saying, "I have to keep watching." That night, Sarah woke up to find him gone. The bed was cold. She ran downstairs. Every curtain in the house was wide open. The front door was unlocked. And David? Gone. No footprints outside. No signs of struggle, like he had never been there at all. The only thing left was a single handprint on the glass. A handprint from the outside, but the fingers were too long, and the shape was wrong. A week later, Sarah received an email from David's account. It had no subject, just a single attachment. A photo, blurry, taken from inside the house, facing the bedroom window. Outside, against the glass, was a dark figure, tall, grinning, with David's face. And beneath the photo, 2 words, "Still watching. The house remains abandoned. No one lives there anymore. But some nights, if you walk past, you might see a shadow in the window. And if you hear tap, 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 don't look." Story number 6. The Man Who Came Back Wrong. An unsolved American horror that should never have happened. On October 12, 2009, a 27-year-old hiker named Mark Whitmore vanished in the dense forests of Black Elk Wilderness, South Dakota. Mark was an experienced outdoorsman. He had hiked in remote areas before, always careful, always prepared. But on his 4th day in the wilderness, he made a disturbing phone call to his fiancée, Emily Clark. His voice was shaking. "Something's not right," he whispered. "I think I'm being followed." Emily asked him by who. There was a long pause. Then Mark said, "It's not a person." That was the last thing he ever said. Then the call cut out. Search teams looked for Mark for 3 weeks. They found his tent, his backpack, even his journal, but no sign of him. Until 6 months later, when Mark came back. On April 3, 2010, at exactly 4:17 a.m., Mark Whitmore staggered out of the woods. Dirty, thin, silent. A truck driver saw him walking along a deserted road, barefoot, eyes wide and empty. When police picked him up, they expected to find a man on the edge of death. But Mark wasn't injured. He wasn't dehydrated. And even stranger, he was wearing the exact same clothes he had on the day he disappeared. But they were clean, too clean. No mud, no rips, no sign that he had been in the wilderness for half a year. When the officer asked where he had been, Mark just stared. Then he whispered, "Nowhere." Doctors found nothing wrong with Mark. Physically, he was perfectly healthy, but his behavior was strange. Emily was relieved to have him back. But on their first night together, she noticed something off. Mark didn't blink as much as he used to. His movements were too slow, too controlled, like he was concentrating too hard on acting normal. And the worst part, he didn't sleep. At 2:43 a.m., Emily woke up to the sound of whispering. She turned over in bed. Mark was sitting on the edge of the mattress, facing the wall, muttering. First, she thought he was praying. Then she listened closer. The words were wrong, like a recording playing backward. Emily reached out and touched his shoulder. His skin was ice cold. Mark stopped whispering, but his lips kept moving, even though no sound was coming out. The next morning, Emily found Mark standing in front of the hallway mirror. Just standing, not moving, not blinking, just staring at himself. She watched from the doorway. That's when she saw it. Mark took a step forward, but his reflection took a step back, like it was lagging behind. Emily's heart pounded. Then, in the reflection, Mark's lips stretched into a grin. Too wide, too forced. Emily gasped. Mark turned to look at her, and his face was completely normal, like it never happened. That night, while Mark was in the shower, Emily searched his old backpack. She found his satellite phone. It was dead. But when she charged it, there was one last recording. A 3-minute audio file, dated the night Mark disappeared. Emily pressed play. First, it was just wind, leaves rustling. Then, Mark's voice, shaking. "It's following me." Silence. "It doesn't have a face." Breathing. The sound of running. "It's trying to look like me." Then, a deep, distorted voice whispered, "Let me in." The recording cut off. Emily stared at the phone, her hands trembling. She looked toward the bathroom, where Mark was humming in the shower. But the tune wasn't anything human. Chapter 5, The Final Change. That night, Emily woke up to find Mark standing at the bedroom door, motionless, watching her, smiling. But something was wrong with his shadow. It was twitching, moving before he did, like it was controlling him, like it wasn't really his. Emily screamed. Mark finally spoke. "I'm not Mark." Then, all the lights went out. The next morning, police received a 911 call from Emily's neighbor. She had heard shrieking from Emily's house, then silence. When officers arrived, the front door was open. Mark and Emily were gone. Inside, the only thing left was a single handprint on the mirror, too large to be Mark's, and beneath it, scratched into the glass, "Let me in." Since 2010, at least 4 other missing hikers have returned under similar circumstances. All were found months later. All were different, and in every case, their loved ones disappeared soon after. If someone you lost comes back, make sure it's really them. Story number 7. The Silent Caller. An unsolved American mystery that should not have happened. On August 9th, 2017, at exactly 2:37 a.m., Detective John Mercer received a phone call. He was half asleep in his apartment in Chicago when his phone buzzed loudly. It was an unknown number. John was used to late-night calls. He was a homicide detective. But when he answered, no one spoke. Just silence. And then, a whisper. One that chilled him to his bones. "I found you." The line went dead. John sat up, heart pounding. The voice had sounded wrong. Too close. Too familiar. He checked his phone's call log. The number was all zeros, and the timestamp read midnight, like the call had come from nowhere. That was the beginning of the nightmare. The next morning, John traced the call, but there was no record of it, like it had never happened. Then, at 2:37 a.m. the next night, his phone rang again. Unknown number. He let it go to voicemail. The next morning, he played the message. The whispering voice was back. But this time, it said something new. "Turn around." John froze, because in the background of the recording, there was the sound of his apartment door creaking open. John was no stranger to strange cases, but this was different. Something wasn't right. So he started digging. He ran a database search on similar calls. One hit came back. A missing person, Elliot Grayson, disappeared August 9th, 1997, exactly 20 years before John got the first call. John's blood ran cold, because Elliot Grayson looked exactly like him. That night, John locked every door and window. But at 2:37 a.m., the phone rang again. This time, he answered. "Who are you?" he demanded. Silence. Then the whisper. "You know me." John felt his stomach drop. The voice sounded just like his own. Then, a new message. "I need to come back." John's phone screen flickered. For a split second, he saw his own reflection in the screen. But the face wasn't his. It was Elliot Grayson's. And he was smiling. John pulled Elliot's missing person file. There was a final photo taken of Elliot before he vanished. It showed him standing in front of a mirror. John's stomach twisted, because Elliot's reflection in the mirror didn't match the way he was standing. It was staring straight at the camera, grinning, like it knew something no one else did. John turned the photo over. There was a message scrawled in red ink. "Don't answer the call." That night, John's phone rang at 2:37 a.m. The screen glitched. Unknown caller. He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed a hammer and smashed his phone. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, from inside his apartment, His landline rang. John's heart stopped. He didn't own a landline. He turned slowly. The phone sat on his kitchen counter, ringing. The caller ID read, John Mercer, his own name, his own number. The ringing wouldn't stop. With shaking hands, John picked up the receiver. He didn't say a word. Neither did the caller. But in the silence, he heard it. Breathing. Then, a final whisper. I'm outside. And from the hallway, John heard his front door unlock. The next morning, Detective John Mercer was gone. His apartment was locked from the inside. His phone was shattered. The only thing left was his badge, sitting in the center of his kitchen table. No signs of a struggle, no leads, just vanished, like he had never existed. Since John's disappearance, multiple people have reported receiving late-night calls from unknown numbers. The calls always come at 2:37 a.m., and all the callers report hearing a whisper that says one of two things: turn around, or I found you. If you ever get a call at 2:37 a.m., don't answer. Story number 8. The House That Remembered, an unsolved American mystery that still watches. On September 5, 1994, in a quiet town in Maine, 7-year-old Daniel Forrester went missing. His mother, Linda, last saw him playing outside their new home, an old Victorian house that had been abandoned for decades before they moved in. She heard a knock at the front door, a single, slow knock. When she went to answer it, the door was already open, and Daniel was gone. They searched for weeks. No signs, no clues. Then, on September 5, 2014, exactly 20 years later, Daniel Forrester came back. But something was wrong with him, because he hadn't aged a single day. Linda was 54 years old when her son returned, but Daniel was still 7, still wearing the same clothes he had on the day he vanished, still carrying his favorite toy car in his pocket, still looking at her with the same confused eyes, like no time had passed. She broke down in tears, held him, but something felt off. His skin was cold, his heartbeat was slow, and when she looked into his eyes, she saw something watching her from inside, something that wasn't Daniel. Linda took Daniel to the hospital. Doctors ran every test, brain scans, DNA testing. Everything came back normal, except Daniel's fingerprints had changed. The ridges weren't random. They formed words, tiny, overlapping words, written in some unknown language. The doctors were disturbed, but they had no explanation. That night, Linda took Daniel home. She put him to bed, locked every door, checked on him every hour. But at 3:15 a.m., she woke up to a sound, a slow knock at the front door. And when she went to check Daniel's room, he was gone again. But this time, his bed was soaking wet, like he had been sleeping underwater. Desperate, Linda searched through the old house for clues. She remembered the original blueprints, ones she had found in the attic when they first moved in. But when she unrolled them, her breath caught. There was a hidden room, a room that wasn't supposed to exist, right behind the wall of Daniel's bedroom. Her hands trembled as she ran to his room. She knocked on the wall, and it echoed hollow. Then, from inside the wall, she heard breathing, not a child's, something deeper, something wrong. And then, in a voice that wasn't Daniel's, it whispered, "Why did you leave the door open?" Linda called a construction crew the next day. They tore open the wall, and behind it they found a spiral staircase, leading down to a room that shouldn't exist, a room that smelled like damp earth. The walls were covered in handprints, hundreds of them, some small, some too large to be human. And in the center of the floor, they found Daniel's old toy car, but the dust around it was undisturbed, like it had been placed there just seconds ago. Linda staggered back, and when she looked up, she saw it. A tall, thin shadow standing in the corner of the room, watching, then smiled. And she heard her son's voice whisper, "Don't let it out." The next day, Linda moved out. She left everything behind, never spoke about what she saw. But the house never stayed empty for long. Every few years, new families moved in, and every time, Someone disappeared. A child, a guest, a neighbor, always on September 5th. And then, weeks later, a single knock at the door, and someone would come back. But they were never the same. Epilogue. The final recordings. The house still stands today. In 2023, a paranormal investigation team spent the night inside. They set up cameras, microphones, motion detectors. They were inside for 6 hours. Then, every camera shut off at exactly 3:15 a.m. The team was found the next morning, unconscious, lying in a perfect circle on the floor, and their audio recordings captured only one thing: a voice, whispering through the static. It remembers you. Final note: the door is still open. No one knows what's inside the house now. No one knows where Daniel Forrester went, or if he ever really came back. But if you ever visit a house that feels too old, if you ever hear a knock in the middle of the night, and if you ever wake up to find a door standing open, close it before something steps through. Story number 9. The Vanishing Cabin, an unsolved mystery in the American wilderness. In October 1998, a hiker named Joseph Mathers disappeared in the Black Hills National Forest of South Dakota. He was an experienced outdoorsman. He had a GPS, food, and supplies. But on the third day of his solo hiking trip, Joseph radioed for help. His voice was shaking. "I'm lost, but I found a cabin. Static. Then, something's inside." That was his last transmission. Search teams scoured the area for weeks. No signs of him. No signs of the cabin. It was like neither had ever existed. 20 years later, in 2018, journalist Erin Calloway began researching the case. She found something strange. Old survey maps from the 1920s showed a cabin deep in the Black Hills. It had been labeled Mathers Lodge, but after 1950, it vanished from every map, like it had been erased. But who erased it, and why? Erin was determined to find out. Erin hiked into the Black Hills in October 2018, exactly 20 years after Joseph's disappearance. She carried the old maps, a GPS, and a journal where she recorded everything. On her third day, she found something. Not the cabin, but a carved message on a tree. The words were deep, jagged, desperate. "Don't stay after dark." Below it, another carving. "They opened the door." That night, Erin set up camp. But something felt off. The air was too still, and she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The next morning, Erin followed the old maps again. She walked for hours. Then, through the trees, she saw it. A cabin, just sitting there, like it had been waiting. The wood was old and gray, covered in moss. The windows were shattered. The door was half open. Erin's hands trembled as she took a photo. Her camera glitched. The screen showed static, and for a split second, she saw a figure standing in the doorway. Then, it was gone, like it had never been there. But Erin wasn't alone. Inside, the air smelled like rotting wood. The floor was covered in old, brittle leaves. And in the corner, a wooden table, with an open journal. She turned the pages. The writing was messy, scrawled in panic. It was Joseph Mathers' journal, his final entries, and they made Erin's blood run cold. Joseph's final entries, October 5th, 1998. Found the cabin. It wasn't on my map, but I had no choice. A storm was coming. I'm staying the night, October 6th, 1998. I hear something outside, footsteps, but there's no one here. October 7th, 1998. I made a mistake. The door, it's not normal. It doesn't open to the outside anymore. It opens to somewhere else. October 8th, 1998. Something came through. I can hear it breathing. I can hear it whispering my name. The final page had just 2 words, written over and over. "IT knows." Erin stepped back. Her breath came in shaky gasps. She turned toward the cabin door. It had been half open when she arrived. But now, it was shut. And then, it slowly creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness. A black void. Not the forest. Not the world outside. Just emptiness. And then, a hand reached out, long, thin, wrong, gripping the edge of the door, pulling itself through. Erin ran. She never looked back. She never stopped until she reached her car. And when she checked her camera, the photos of the cabin were gone. But there was one new photo, one she never took. It was Joseph Mathers, standing in the doorway of the cabin, his face twisted in a silent scream. Erin never returned to the Black Hills, but she still dreams of the cabin. She still hears the whispers, and every October, she receives an email. No sender, no subject, just a single message. The door is still open. The Black Hills are still there. People still hike through them. And sometimes, hikers go missing. If you ever find a cabin that isn't on your map, if the door is open, don't go inside. Story number 10. The Midnight Motel. An unsolved mystery of the American highways. The Silver Pines Motel sat on a lonely stretch of Route 160 in New Mexico. It had been there since 1954, a forgotten relic on the roadside, lit by a flickering neon sign. No one knew who owned it. No one ever checked out. And yet, every year, travelers vanished without a trace after spending the night there. One of them was Adam Brooks, a journalist investigating strange disappearances. On March 3, 2011, he sent his editor a final email at 3:12 a.m. Something is wrong. The numbers on my room door keep changing. That was the last anyone heard from him. His car was still in the parking lot, his luggage untouched, his room key missing, and the motel's front desk? It was empty, like no one had ever been there at all. In 2023, a paranormal investigator named Megan Holloway arrived at the Silver Pines Motel. She had spent years tracking unsolved cases, and this motel had a pattern. Every traveler who vanished stayed in room 6, but after they disappeared, room 6's number changed. Sometimes it became room 7, other times room 3. No one ever stayed in the same room twice. It was like the motel itself was hiding something, or worse, rearranging itself. At the front desk, Megan found an old guest book. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the names inside were perfectly legible. She flipped through it, searching for Adam Brooks. And then, her breath caught. Not only was his name there, but so was hers. Megan Holloway, room 6, February 14, 2024. Her hands trembled. It was a month away, but she had never stayed here before. So how was her name already written down? As if the motel was expecting her. As if she had already checked in. Determined, Megan took room 6. The room was normal at first. A dusty bed, an old TV, a cracked mirror. She set up cameras, took notes, and at exactly 3:12 a.m., the numbers on her door changed. Room 6 became room 9. The walls groaned. The furniture shifted slightly. She flung open the door, and the hallway was different. It stretched on forever. Dozens of doors. None of them had numbers. None of them led outside. Megan turned back, but her room was gone, like it had never been there at all. And then she heard footsteps, coming closer, but no one was there. Just the distant hum of a TV playing static. And a voice, whispering through the air. "You were always here." Megan stumbled down the endless hallway. She banged on doors. No response, until she found one door slightly open. Inside a dimly lit room, an old man sat on the bed. His skin was pale, his eyes hollow. He looked at her and said, "You should leave before you forget who you are." Megan's pulse raced. "Who are you?" she asked. The man smiled sadly. "I checked in back in 1971. Her breath hitched. "Then why don't you leave?" The man gestured to the window. She turned and saw herself still sleeping in the bed. The real her. And yet, she was standing here, watching herself from the outside. Panicked, Megan ran. She reached another door, room 12. She burst inside. The room was identical to hers, but on the bed, there was an old, dust-covered camera. She picked it up, checked the photos. Her stomach dropped. Dozens of pictures of herself. Some from moments ago, some from years she hadn't lived yet. And in the final photo, she saw Adam Brooks, standing in the hallway. His eyes were missing, his mouth was stitched shut, and below the photo, a note scratched in shaky handwriting. "Don't look in the mirror," but it was too late. Megan turned, and in the cracked mirror, her reflection was smiling, even though her own face was frozen in fear. Then her reflection whispered, "Now it's your turn." The next morning, the motel was silent. Megan's cameras were gone. Her notebook vanished. The guest book at the front desk? Still there. And when the next traveler walked in that night, there was a new name at the bottom of the list. Megan Holloway, room 6, checked in, but no checkout date, because no one ever checks out. In March 2024, a new journalist investigated the Silver Pines Motel. They found a single piece of paper in room 6, the last words of Megan Holloway. "The motel isn't haunted. It's alive. Feeds on time, on memories, on you. If you stay too long, you forget you ever left." The journalist left immediately, but before they drove away, they glanced at the neon sign. The flickering words no longer read Silver Pines Motel. They read, "Vacancy. Room 6 available." And behind the front desk, a woman in a red coat was waiting, smiling. "If the numbers on your door change overnight, leave before the motel remembers you." Story number 11. The Lazarus File. In 1986, a young nurse named Sherry Rasmussen was murdered in Los Angeles. Police pinned down no suspects, and the case gradually went cold. It took 23 years and revolutionary breakthroughs in forensic science before LAPD detectives could finally assemble the pieces of the puzzle. When they did, they found themselves facing one of the unlikeliest murder suspects in the city's history. It was a burglary gone awry. That's how it looked, at least, to the Los Angeles police detectives who arrived at a gated condo complex in the Van Nuys section of Los Angeles on the evening of February 24, 1986. The body of a 29-year-old nurse and 3-month newlywed, Sherry Rasmussen, had been discovered by her husband, John Rutan. When Rutan, an engineer, had come home from work at 5:55 p.m., he'd known instantly that something was wrong. The garage door was open and the silver 2-door BMW he'd bought Rasmussen as an engagement gift was gone. It seemed strange that she would not be home. He knew she had called in sick to work that morning. When Rutan rushed inside, he found his wife's body in the ransacked living room. Shards from a broken porcelain vase littered the floor. A TV wall unit was partially collapsed. A credenza drawer had been yanked out and its contents, mostly documents, dumped on the floor. Examining the scene, the lead homicide detective, Lal Mayer, began to piece together what he thought had taken place. Burglars must have entered through the unlocked front door. While one removed electronics from the wall unit, the other went upstairs and was surprised by Rasmussen. Her attire, robe, t-shirt, and panties suggested she had not been expecting visitors. Rasmussen was 6 feet tall and fit, and the ensuing struggle was ferocious. It evidently began in the dining room on the second floor of the townhouse, where shots were fired from a .38 caliber pistol, one of which may have hit Rasmussen. Hearing the shots, the downstairs burglar probably fled, ditching the video components. A blood trail down the stairs and a bloody handprint near the front door suggested Rasmussen had tried to escape or reach the panic button on the alarm panel located there. But her assailant followed. In the living room, Rasmussen had been bitten on her left forearm, perhaps while grappling for the gun, and then struck over the head with the heavy vase, a blow that likely incapacitated her. The assailant had then taken a quilt from across the room, presumably to muffle the gun's report, and fired more shots through it, killing Rasmussen. A housekeeper in the unit next door later said she'd heard a scuffle and a scream, but no gunshots. Imagining the din to be a domestic altercation, she hadn't called the police. In all, Rasmussen had been shot 3 times in the chest, the bullets piercing her heart, lungs, and spine. When it was over, the killer stole the BMW parked in the garage. That most items in the house appeared undisturbed, including Rasmussen's jewelry box, sitting in plain view on her dresser, seemed to Mayer further evidence of a rushed exit. Amy Weissmeyer, It wasn't until nearly 2 o'clock in the morning that Lloyd Mahoney, a criminalist from the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, arrived to examine the body. It was his second homicide of the night. Mahoney began by checking for trace evidence around the victim's body. Hair, fibers, anything unusual, but he found nothing of note. Next, he opened a sexual assault kit and collected a series of swabs and slides. When he noticed the bite mark on Rasmussen's arm, Mahoney selected a 6-inch swab housed in a tube with a red rubber stopper. He removed the stopper and carefully swabbed the impression left by the assailant's teeth. He reinserted the swab into the tube, squeezed the stopper shut, and labeled it with his initials and the coroner's case number. He placed the tube inside a 5 by 7-inch LA Coroner's Physical Evidence envelope, on which he wrote Sherry Rasmussen's name, a description of the contents, and where he'd obtained them. Then he sealed it, noting the date and time he had done so. The sun was just coming up over the San Fernando Valley when Mahoney completed his work at the crime scene. He drove directly to the coroner's office, where an evidence custodian booked the swab of the bite mark on Sherry Rasmussen's arm into evidence at 10:32 a.m. on February 25, 1986. Transcript of police interview with Stephanie Lazarus, June 5, 2009. Detective Jaramillo, I didn't want to talk about this in the squad room, 'cause Stephanie Lazarus. Oh, that's okay. Detective Jaramillo, I don't know what people are listening. We've been assigned a case that we've been looking at, and reviewing the case, there's some notes to see as far as your name being mentioned. Stephanie Lazarus. Oh, okay. Detective Jaramillo, do you know John Rutan? Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, Sherry's parents, arrived in Los Angeles from Arizona the day after the murder. Nels immediately sought out Mayer, the homicide detective, who informed him that the police were looking for one or more burglars in connection with the killing. He also told Nels they had ruled out John Rutan as a suspect. Nels mentioned that his daughter had complained 1 or 2 months earlier about an ex-girlfriend of her husband's who had shown up at Sherry's hospital one day and confronted her. Nels didn't know the ex-girlfriend's name, but he knew she was a Los Angeles police officer. In Nels's mind, she was a prime suspect. Mayer made a note of the ex-girlfriend in the case file, but apparently never followed up. The stolen BMW was found abandoned nearby about a week later, but it offered up no further clues. 2 months after the murder, a pair of men attempted a burglary a few blocks from Sherry's condo. When Mayer learned that one of them had brandished a gun, these unidentified burglars became the focus of his homicide investigation. But the suspects remained elusive, and months passed without further leads. In late October, the Los Angeles Times ran a story on the now 8-month-old case, reporting that the Rasmussens were offering a $10,000 reward for any information regarding the suspects in their daughter's murder, whom Mayer described in the article as 2 Latino men between 5 feet 4 inches and 5 feet 6 inches tall. In 1986, the year Rasmussen was killed, Los Angeles recorded 831 murders, a figure nearly triple what it is today. By the end of the year, LAPD homicide detectives had solved 538 of those murders, a clearance rate of 65%. Of them, 463 were cleared by arrest and 75 cleared other, a catch-all designation for cases in which there is sufficient information to support the arrest of a suspect, but, for reasons outside police control, no arrest can be made, for instance, when the suspect is dead or cannot be extradited to Los Angeles. LAPD homicide detectives track their clearance rate the way pro athletes track their season stats. It's the number by which their performance is judged, both within the unit and up the chain of command. The clearance rates reported at the end of each calendar year stand in perpetuity. They cannot be corrected through later arrests. If a homicide occurs in late December but an arrest is made in January, credit for the clearance is taken in the year of the arrest, not the year of the murder. One corollary of this quirk is that a division can raise its current year clearance rate by solving old cases as well as fresh ones. In 2009, for instance, the LAPD's Olympic Division recorded 7 new murders, but its detectives were able to solve a total of 15, giving the unit an eye-popping clearance rate of 214%. At midnight on December 31st, when the LAPD closed the books on its 1986 homicide statistics, Sherry Rasmussen's murder was indelibly recorded as one of 293 unsolved cases. Detective Jaramillo, was there ever any relationship or anything that developed between you and him? Stephanie Lazarus. Yeah, we dated. Detective Jaramillo. Aha. Stephanie Lazarus. What's this all about? Detective Jaramillo. It's relating to his wife. Few people could have predicted in early 1986 that the science of police work was about to take an epical leap forward. Not since 1901, when Scotland Yard validated fingerprinting for the purpose of criminal identification, had detectives' power to solve crimes been so profoundly transformed. 7 months after Sherry Rasmussen's death, half a world away from Los Angeles, DNA was used in a criminal investigation for the first time. Two 15-year-old girls from neighboring villages outside Leicester, in the English Midlands, had been killed, one of them that summer and one 3 years earlier. Both victims had been raped and strangled, their bodies left beside out-of-the-way footpaths. The inescapable conclusion for both police and terrified residents was that a serial predator was hiding among the local population. As Joseph Wambaugh, the LAPD detective turned crime writer, recounted masterfully in his 1989 book, The Blooding, an unprecedented force of 200 police officers was assembled to hunt for the murderer. Suspicion quickly fell upon a 17-year-old boy who seemed to have an unnatural interest in the second crime scene. When the boy was arrested and interrogated, he offered a rambling half-confession to the more recent murder, alternately describing his acts in great detail and then, moments later, denying he'd done anything wrong. The police were certain that he had killed both girls. But no matter how hard they pushed him, the boy refused to confess to the first murder. By that time, police laboratories in England and America were accustomed to analyzing biological evidence, typically blood or semen, using a laboratory method called serology to determine blood type. It was useful for investigative purposes, but too imprecise to serve as a smoking gun. Serological testing that the police had expected would link the boy to the victims had come up negative. But, in light of the other evidence, they discounted the results. Someone mentioned to investigators a newspaper article about a local geneticist named Alec Jeffreys, who had developed a novel process for mapping gene variations using DNA molecules. Jeffreys, who would later be knighted for his contributions to forensic science, realized almost instantly the potential of the new technology, for which he coined the term genetic fingerprinting. Police asked Jeffreys to develop DNA profiles from the suspect's blood sample and from semen at the two crime scenes. The results stunned everyone. The same person had indeed raped and killed both girls. But he wasn't the boy whom police had in custody. The first criminal suspect ever subjected to forensic DNA testing was thus exonerated by it. The investigation went back to the drawing board in all respects except one. Police now had a DNA profile of their killer, who they suspected lived nearby. In January 1987, a bold plan was announced. The police requested that all male residents between the ages of 17 and 34 provide blood samples for DNA analysis, to eliminate themselves as suspects. No one was forced to participate in the blooding, as the DNA dragnet came to be called, and few expected that the killer would volunteer himself. But police hoped that the list of those who declined to participate would provide new leads. Several months and thousands of blood samples later, the police received a curious tip. A woman who worked at a bakery in Leicester had been gossiping with co-workers at a pub when one mentioned that he had agreed to take the blood test on someone else's behalf. The woman called the police, and the naif who'd taken the surrogate blood test promptly fingered the man who had talked him into it, a fellow baker with the improbable name of Colin Pitchfork. When confronted, Pitchfork confessed to the killings, and DNA analysis later confirmed that he had raped both girls. In January 1988, Pitchfork became the first murderer in history to be convicted on the basis of DNA evidence. All over the world, newspapers hailed the breakthrough and marveled at the ways DNA forensics might revolutionize detective work. Detective Stearns. Had you ever met his wife? Stephanie Lazarus. I may have. Detective Stearns. Do you remember her name or anything, or what she did for a living or where she worked or anything about her? Stephanie Lazarus. Well, I think she was a nurse. I don't understand why you're talking about some guy I dated a million years ago. Detective Jaramillo, yeah. Detective Stearns. Well, do Do you know what happened to his wife? Stephanie Lazarus. Yeah, I know she got killed. In Los Angeles, the first two defendants told by prosecutors that DNA evidence would be used against them promptly pleaded guilty. The third, in 1989, was an accused rapist named Henry Wilds. The prosecutor in his case was Lisa Kahn, a deputy in the district attorney's Van Nuys office. The same branch that would have handled the Rasmussen murder a few years earlier. Had a suspect ever been arrested, Wilds was charged with committing 2 rapes in 1986 and 1987. The LAPD had collected semen at both crime scenes, and Kahn received permission to submit the evidence to a private lab for DNA analysis, which confirmed that Wilds' DNA profile matched that of the rapist. Jury selection began in January 1990. Kahn recalls her desire to find jurors who would be able to make sense of this new universe of DNA testimony. We were looking for a bright jury, she explains. So I get up there first and I say, has anybody ever heard of DNA? Some little retired guy raises his hand and says, yeah, I know. It means does not apply. DNA experts testified for both sides. The jury, which included Kahn's little retired guy, voted to convict. In the wake of the successful prosecution, Kahn became responsible for handling any DNA admissibility hearing that took place in Los Angeles County. Forensic scientists and legal historians refer to the late 1980s and early 90s as the height of the DNA wars, as DNA evidence was accepted state by state, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. Defense attorneys were initially helpless against the highly credentialed scientific experts called by prosecutors to testify. But that began to change in 1989, when 2 lawyers, Peter Neufeld and Barry Scheck, convinced a New York judge that poor laboratory procedures warranted exclusion of DNA evidence that had been introduced against their client. The decision, People v. Castro, sent shock waves through the criminal justice system. Over the next few years, in courtrooms across America, the adversarial process worked its magic. All concerned, prosecutors, defense lawyers, forensic scientists, judges, had to raise their game. Laboratories became more careful with evidence. Trial courts grew more familiar with DNA, and higher courts affirmed its admissibility as a matter of law. By 1994, the DNA wars were basically over, as a singular case would affirm. On June 13th of that year, LAPD homicide detectives visited the Rockingham Avenue mansion of O.J. Simpson to notify him that his ex-wife and an acquaintance of hers had been stabbed to death outside her Brentwood condominium. Simpson was soon linked to the crime by forensic evidence. In particular, a blood-soaked glove that a detective named Mark Furman reported finding on Simpson's property. Defense lawyers would later suggest that Furman had planted it. On behalf of the prosecution, Kahn coordinated the DNA testing of more than 50 blood samples that seemed to tie Simpson inextricably to the killings. Yet contrary to expectations, Simpson's dream team of defense lawyers did not fight to keep DNA results out. Nor did they challenge the forensic value of DNA evidence during the trial. Ultimately, the not guilty verdict turned more on Furman's alleged racism and the LAPD's carelessness in handling evidence than on the validity of the DNA. Indeed, by the end of the trial, the DNA results had ironically become a pillar of the defense's alternate narrative of the murder. Of course, it was O.J.'s DNA. It had been planted at the scene. By one count, the term DNA was spoken in court 10,000 times during the 9-month trial, in addition to innumerable citations on television and in print. Just 5 years after a potential juror had confidently informed Lisa Kahn that DNA stood for does not apply, it had become a household term. Detective Stearns, and you said you thought his wife was a nurse. Do you have any idea where she was working at the time? Or did he ever mention that to you? Was it a hospital or a doctor's office? Stephanie Lazarus. I'm sure he must have mentioned it. I mean, now that you're bringing it up, I think she worked at a hospital somewhere. And yeah, I may have met her at a hospital. I may have talked to her once or twice. Detective Stearns. At a hospital? Stephanie Lazarus. Or more, you know? Even as forensic technology was taking great leaps forward, the investigation into Sherry Rasmussen's murder remained stalled. For years, her parents, Nels and Loretta, did everything possible to keep the case alive. In November 1987, they returned to Los Angeles and held a press conference, at which they renewed their offer of a $10,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. Sherry's widower, John Rutan, was also there. It's been nearly 2 years of hell. Not knowing who did this to Sherry or why, he told the assembled reporters. In 1988, Nels wrote a letter to then Chief of Police Daryl Gates requesting his intervention in the case, specifically looking into the possibility that an ex-girlfriend of Rutan's who was a police officer might have been involved. He received no reply. About that time, Nels again mentioned the ex-girlfriend to the Van Nuys detectives. "You watch too much television," he remembers being told. Into the early 1990s, Loretta called the Van Nuys homicide unit regularly to inquire about Sherry's case. In 1993, the Rasmussens traveled to Van Nuys for a face-to-face meeting with one of the detectives who had inherited the case when Lyle Mayer retired. Meyer's successor explained that he had reviewed the original case notes and tried to advance the investigation, but he had been unable to identify any suspects, and prospects for new leads were poor. Nels brought up an article about DNA forensics he had read in a science magazine and offered to pay for DNA analysis of the evidence at a private lab. The detective turned him down. "Move on with your lives," he advised the Rasmussens. After that meeting, Loretta stopped calling. Meanwhile, in a freezer in the Los Angeles County Coroner's office, alongside biological evidence from hundreds of other murders, the swab of the bite mark on Sherry Rasmussen's arm lay waiting for forensic science, and the LAPD's scrutiny to catch up with it. Detective Jaramillo, "Do you know what the circumstances were regarding her death?" Stephanie Lazarus, "Geez, let me think back. Geez, I don't know if it was, if it was burglary or something. Yeah, it's been so many years." Detective Jaramillo, "Do you remember her first name?" Stephanie Lazarus, Sherry. "I don't know. Something." If Lisa Kahn was the district attorney's resident DNA geek, that role in the LAPD was filled by Detective David Lampkin. In 1981, as a young cop, Lampkin had requested assignment to the Automated Information Division, which, among other responsibilities, maintained a citywide crime database that could be searched by modus operandi or other basic criteria, for instance, all liquor store robberies in which the suspect wore a mask. Primitive as the IBM punch card and mainframe computer databases might seem today, they were cutting edge at the time, and they nurtured Lampkin's interest in how technology could be used to solve cases. He made detective quickly and requested assignment to a sex crimes unit. Lampkin excelled at the work, but by 1990, he felt burned out and decided to shift to homicides. At the dawn of the DNA age, Lampkin's background investigating sex crimes proved an excellent foundation for homicide work. Given the number of drive-by shootings then occurring in the city, LAPD detectives were far more accustomed to picking shell casings up off the street than searching for hair strands, semen stains, and other barely visible bodily traces. Lampkin, by comparison, had been working with biological evidence for years and was already convinced of DNA's potential. Moreover, he believed strongly that the LAPD had a moral obligation to do its best to solve cold cases. For these families, this stuff never goes away, he says. In 1993, Lampkin was working homicide at the Hollywood Division, where he had a front-row seat for the conclusion of perhaps the coldest case ever solved by the LAPD. The victim, Thora Rose, had been brutally killed in her apartment in October 1963. At the time, detectives had collected more than 30 fingerprint lifts from the scene, but they had never identified a suspect. In 1990, when the lifts were uploaded to a fingerprint database, the computer reported a match with a previously unknown suspect named Vernon Robinson. In 1963, Robinson had been an 18-year-old Navy recruit stationed in San Diego. After leaving the Navy in 1966, he fell into drugs and crime, and was eventually sentenced to 3 years at San Quentin for assault and robbery. Robinson emerged from prison a changed man. He got sober and enrolled in college. Later, he married and raised a family. When he was arrested for killing Thora Rose, Robinson was a 45-year-old manager for a building maintenance company in Minneapolis. The LAPD detective who arrested him had been 8 years old when the murder occurred. In court, Robinson cut a respectable figure. His children and members of his church packed the gallery in support of him. Deputy DA Paul Turley, in his closing argument, addressed head-on the defendant's evident rehabilitation and the 3 decades that had passed between the crime and the trial. "I'm very happy to stand in opposition to the principle that you are entitled to one free murder every 30 years, Turley told the jury. The jurors and the judge agreed. Robinson was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The Rose case made Lampkin eager to see how many other homicides from the city's past might be solved using new technology. LAPD homicide detectives had always been free to work cold cases, but only as time permitted between fresh murders, which wasn't very often. Now, using the new fingerprint and ballistics databases that had come online, Lampkin found he was able to clear some old homicides fairly easily. Although he didn't solve every fresh case he worked, he closed enough old ones to maintain a remarkable 100% personal clearance rate every year from 1991 through 1996. In October 1998, the FBI launched a DNA database called the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, which gave detectives the ability to compare DNA samples collected at crime scenes with the DNA profiles of legions of potential suspects. When, in 2000, a $50 million state grant became available to fund DNA testing in certain unsolved murders, Lampkin and Lisa Kahn seized the opportunity to propose a joint LAPD/D.A task force to tackle the citywide backlog. After considerable political machinations, the LAPD's new cold case homicide unit went operational in November 2001. The cold case unit initially consisted of 7 detectives, 3 teams of 2 with Lampkin at the helm. The office the unit was given, a 250-square-foot former janitorial storage space, was so cramped that every time someone wanted to leave, others had to pull in their chairs to make room. The unit gradually came to grips with the magnitude of its caseload. The coldest homicide on the LAPD's books was, literally, the first one. The unsolved murder of a man named Simon Christensen in downtown Los Angeles on the night of September 9, 1899. A century later, the unit could not do much about that one. But how far back could they go, given the inevitable loss and decay of physical evidence? I knew from experience that there was probably nothing left from earlier than 1960, Lampkin says. The unit's initial focus would therefore be on unsolved homicides committed from 1960 through 1998. Using the LAPD's annual statistics, Lampkin tallied the numbers. During those 39 years, 23,713 murders took place in Los Angeles. Of those cases, 13,300 were cleared by arrest, and another 2,668 were recorded as cleared other. That left 7,745 cold cases. Page by page, for months, the detectives combed the old homicide summary books. We were looking for cases that had the best chance for us to potentially work with, given the small numbers of detectives we had, says Rick Jackson, who was part of the original unit. So we looked for sexually motivated murders where there was a better chance for DNA. We looked at maybe a burglary murder that was unsolved. Because a burglary murder, someone is going to have broken into the place, spent some time there. In an indoor crime scene, obviously, the longer you are there, the more you do. Whether you're sexually assaulting, burglarizing, moving around, ransacking, you increase the chance for good fingerprints. Late in 2002, when the cold case unit finished its initial screening of all unsolved homicides committed in Los Angeles from 1960 through 1998, it judged 1,400 to have good forensic potential for reinvestigation. Among them, the 1986 murder of Sherry Rasmussen. Stephanie Lazarus. I mean, that's, now that you guys are bringing all this stuff up, I mean, that sounds familiar. But again, I mean, what's this got to do with me dating him and, her getting killed? I mean, I don't have anything to do with it. Detective Stearns. Well, like we said, we just literally got this the other day. And then so, obviously it's like Stephanie Lazarus. Yeah, Detective Stearns, we recognize the name and we, Stephanie Lazarus. Yeah, Detective Stearns, you work next door to us, and so we're trying to get some background. We're trying to figure this out. In February 2003, a year and a half after its formation, the cold case unit made its first arrest, solving the 1983 murder of a young nurse and mother named Elaine Graham. A suspect, Edmund Marr, had been identified at the time but was never prosecuted. Confronted with wiretap evidence and a DNA report that linked him to the murder, Marr eventually pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 16 years to life. 7 months later, in September, the unit cleared 4 cases at once when it arrested its first serial killer, Adolf Laudenberg. A 77-year-old grandfather with a bushy white beard, Laudenberg was suspected of having raped and strangled 4 women between 1972 and 1975. The media quickly dubbed him the Santa Claus Strangler. The detectives possessed the killer's DNA profile, but had no sample from Laudenberg with which they could compare it. A warrant could have forced their suspect to give them a sample, but they weren't sure they had enough evidence to get one. They could also have asked Laudenberg to submit a sample voluntarily, but that would have alerted him that he was a suspect. Detectives have a third way to get a suspect's DNA sample without running afoul of the Fourth Amendment. Collect a voluntarily discarded sample. In this case, it would not be easy. Laudenberg lived in a mobile home that he moved sporadically around Los Angeles. Eventually, a detective arranged to meet at a donut shop to discuss what he described as a series of burglaries from automobiles. Afterward, the coffee cup the old man had used was whisked to the lab and his DNA was harvested from the brim. The profiles matched, and Laudenberg is now serving a life sentence. The press loves these cases, Lampkin says. I mean, it is all positive every time you solve one. If you don't solve one, well, no one solved it. But when you do, you're like a freaking magician. During the summer and fall of 2003, Lampkin's unit was working its way, case by case, through the 1,400 unsolved homicides it had flagged as having good forensic potential. On September 19th, DNA analysis was requested on evidence from the 1986 murder of Sherry Rasmussen. The request reached the desk of a criminalist at the LAPD crime lab, but given staffing shortages, no action was taken on it for more than a year. In December 2004, a criminalist named Jennifer Butterworth noticed the unworked request sitting on her colleague's desk and volunteered to handle it. The first article Butterworth analyzed was a blood swatch taken at the victim's autopsy, which gave her Rasmussen's DNA profile. When she turned to the crime scene evidence, the items she initially tested, a piece of fingernail, a blood-stained towel, yielded only the victim's profile. Then Butterworth noticed that the property sheet listed a bite mark swab. Yet she couldn't find the swab in the rape kit or anywhere else. A week went by before the coroner's office could locate the missing evidence. The 5 by 7-inch envelope, new and crisp when Lloyd Mahoney had sealed it in 1986, was no longer so pristine. Its condition would later be described in court as pretty beaten up and ratty. There was a tear at one end, from which protruded the red-capped top of the tube holding the swab, but the tube itself appeared intact. When Butterworth analyzed the swab, it yielded a mixture of 2 DNA profiles, one of which matched Rasmussen's. The other presumably belonged to her killer. This mystery profile did not return a Cody's hit, which meant the suspect was not in the FBI's DNA database. But a curious detail caught Butterworth's eye. DNA profiles developed since the late 1990s typically include a gender marker. In most violent crimes, the suspect comes up XY or male, but the DNA results in front of Butterworth were XX, meaning that the person who bit Sherry Rasmussen was female. Without the case file, Butterworth had little information regarding theories of the case or possible suspects, and so lacked context for her discovery. But it was certainly unusual. She typed up her conclusions and sent the report to the cold case unit on February 8, 2005. As it happened, just a few months before, California voters had overwhelmingly approved Proposition 69, a ballot measure co-authored by Lisa Kahn. Prop 69 required police to collect DNA samples from all individuals arrested for a felony or a sex crime, as well as from all state prison inmates who had been convicted of such crimes. The DNA profiles of tens of thousands of California inmates were uploaded to the FBI's vast database. As a result, in 2005, Lampkin's unit was swamped with Cody's-based cold hits, DNA reports implicating suspects previously unknown to detectives. As tantalizing a clue as Butterworth's DNA report provided in the Rasmussen case, namely that a woman might be the murderer, it did not point directly to a specific suspect, unlike the many cold hits rolling in thanks to Prop 69. Perhaps for this reason, Butterworth's report went into the Rasmussen case file, and the case file itself went back on the shelf, where it would sit for a few years more. Detective Jaramillo, I know you went to talk with her at the hospital regarding this issue with John to, kind of like, hey, what's going to happen with this thing? But would you ever have followed up to her house where you went to talk to her to say, hey, you know what, Stephanie Lazarus, I don't even know that I knew where they lived. Detective Stearns, But you didn't have any issues with her, right? Stephanie Lazarus. No, I mean, obviously, if he was dating me and dating her, I probably said, hey, pick or something. By early 2007, when David Lamkin retired, the cold case homicide unit had solved more than 40 old murder cases. His successor was Robert Bubb, another veteran homicide detective. Bubb estimates that when he took over the unit, it numbered 10 detectives and had about 120 cases open. The team had by then moved to a new, slightly more spacious squad room on the 5th floor of Parker Center, the LAPD's legendarily decrepit headquarters. But it still didn't have enough space for all the murder books that it had accumulated. Detectives boxed up whichever cases weren't being actively worked and sent them back to the divisions where they had originated, if there was room for them, or to the LAPD archives if there wasn't. As a result, sometime in 2007, the Sherry Rasmussen case file was returned to the Van Nuys division in a cardboard box. By coincidence, Bubb followed it in March 2008, when he accepted a transfer to run the Van Nuys homicide unit, which had just lost its supervising detective and 2 others to retirement. When the dust settled, the squad consisted of Bubb and 3 other detectives, Pete Barba, Mark Martinez, and Jim Nuttall. Whereas Van Nuys once recorded 30 to 40 homicides a year, nowadays it averages 5 to 7. It's a very manageable number of murders for 3 guys to work, Bubb says. In early February 2009, with the squad's most recent homicide cleared, Nuttall and Barba began poking around for an interesting cold case. They settled on Sherry Rasmussen's. It was 4 books when it reached me, 4 books deep, Nuttall says of the case file. They kept a pretty good chronological record of everything that was done over 23 years. When Nuttall reached the 2005 DNA analysis report, he saw immediately that the gender marker was incompatible with the original theory of the case. That jumps off the page at you because when you have that, and you're aware that the case is based on 2 male burglars, well, that alters the entire course of the investigation. You have to go back to square one. The detectives went back over the whole investigation, but this time with the assumption that they were looking for a female suspect. When they finished going through the case file, they had a list of 5 names, among them that of Stephanie Lazarus, who was cited in the original police work as John Rutan's ex-girlfriend. With the further notation, P.O. Nuttall didn't make anything of the initials until he called Rutan, who told him that Lazarus had been a Los Angeles police officer. Nuttall was stunned at the thought that a cop might have killed someone and gotten away with it. It was extremely difficult initially to process that possibility, he says. Wondering whether she might still be on the job, the detectives typed her name into the LAPD's directory, and there she was, Detective Stephanie Lazarus. Nuttall phoned Bubb and told him they had identified the police officer ex-girlfriend, whom Nels Rasmussen had brought up all those years before. The suspects on the squad's list were numbered 1 through 5. Lazarus, considered the least likely suspect, was number 5. The detectives on the Van Nuys squad made 2 pacts regarding the Rasmussen case. First, they agreed that they would maintain total secrecy and would never speak or write Lazarus's name where anyone else might hear or see it. There was no way to know who in the division might be acquainted with her, and they didn't want to dirty her good name in the likely event that she didn't have anything to do with the murder, or tip her off in the unlikely event that she did. Second, they promised one another that they would follow the trail of evidence wherever it led. This was not a random act of violence toward Sherry Rasmussen, Nuttall says. Somebody on that list committed this crime. Stephanie Lazarus. Oh yeah, my cars have been broken into, but no cars have ever been stolen. Detective Jaramillo. Aha. How long? Well, when? Tell me about this, the car getting broken into. Stephanie Lazarus. Well, my car had been broken into several times. Detective Jaramillo. Oh, really? Did you ever lose anything or? Stephanie Lazarus. Yeah, now that you mention it. Let's see. I had a gun that was stolen. The Van Nuys detectives quickly eliminated 3 of the 5 women on their list for having insufficient motive to harm Rasmussen. That left them with only 2 suspects. Lazarus and 1 other woman, a fellow nurse who, according to the original case notes, had occasionally argued with Sherry at the hospital. We were teetering, Bubb recalls. But as far as motive was concerned, the information that we had was that Lazarus and Rutan's relationship had been over since the previous summer. We didn't have anything to establish there was any animosity. The detectives decided they would investigate the nurse first, confirming or eliminating her as a suspect. She was located living in Northern California, and Bub made arrangements with local law enforcement to surreptitiously collect a DNA sample from her. In mid-April, just over 2 months into the new investigation, that DNA report came back negative. The detectives' list was down to one name: Stephanie Lazarus. Fact by fact, the team began piecing together Lazarus's relationship to Sherry Rasmussen. Lazarus and John Ruetten had become close friends at UCLA, where they'd lived in the same dorm. After graduating in the early 1980s, they dated on and off. In 1985, Ruetten began dating Rasmussen seriously. He proposed to her that summer, and they married in November. 3 months later, she was dead. At the time, Lazarus was a 26-year-old patrol officer in her 3rd year with the LAPD. In 1993, she made detective, and in 1996 she married a fellow LAPD officer, with whom she later adopted a little girl. In 2006, Lazarus was assigned to the department's art theft detail, a plum post with a degree of prestige rare for Los Angeles police work. In her long career, she had never been involved in a use-of-force incident or been accused of any misconduct. Still, as the Van Nuys unit continued to dig, other details fell uncomfortably into place. Mark Martinez recalled that in the mid-1980s, most LAPD cops carried a .38 as their backup or off-duty gun, the same caliber weapon indicated on the ballistics report in the Rasmussen murder book. On April 30th, the detectives entered Lazarus's name into the California State Gun Registry, which returned a list of all the firearms she had ever registered. One of them, a .38, had been reported stolen on March 9, 1986, 13 days after the murder. Within a week, the detectives obtained a copy of the stolen gun report. It indicated that shortly after 2 p.m. that Sunday, Lazarus had walked into the lobby of the Santa Monica Police Department, identified herself as an LAPD officer, and told the clerk that her car, parked near Santa Monica Pier, had been broken into. The lock on the driver's side door had been punched, she said, and a blue gym bag stolen. Lazarus listed for the clerk the contents of the stolen bag: clothes, half a dozen cassette tapes, and the handgun, which she described as a Smith & Wesson 5-shot .38 revolver. Without that gun, or more precisely, without a bullet known to have been fired from it, the Van Nuys detectives would have no way to prove or disprove that it was the murder weapon. By this time, Nuttall had spoken on the phone with Nels Rasmussen, Sherry's father, whose persistence and intelligence impressed him. I said, "We need to talk about everything. I need you to walk me through everything from A to Z," Nuttall recalls. He asked Nels about women who might have wanted to harm Sherry, and Nels recounted what he had told detectives in 1986 about Ruetten's cop ex-girlfriend, who his daughter said had confronted her at the hospital where she worked. Given the sensitivity of the unfolding investigation, Nuttall had to be cautious about tipping his hand. But he told Nels, "Give me time to do what I have to do, and I think I'll be able to have an answer for you." Detective Stearns: "Did you have a fight with her?" Stephanie Lazarus: "You mean like we fought?" Detective Stearns: "Yeah. Did you ever duke it out with her?" Stephanie Lazarus: "No, I don't think so. I mean, it just doesn't sound familiar. I mean, what are they saying? So I fought with her, so now, I'm getting the jump, the leap. They're saying, okay, I fought with her, so I must have killed her. Come on. That's, I don't even know who those people are. I can't even say I met any of these people. It's insane." If a case against Lazarus was going to proceed, it was inevitably going to end up with the department's robbery homicide division, the elite detective unit that handles the city's most sensitive and high-profile murder cases. Bub, a veteran of RHD, was determined to deliver an ultra-professional case to them. The detectives had known for a while that they would need to obtain a sample of Lazarus's DNA to compare with the bite mark swab. "We had kicked around the idea of doing it ourselves, doing surreptitious DNA," Bub says. "But the way the circumstances were, there would have been too many variables involved and too much potential for screw-up. We felt it best, if we're going to do this and hand the package to RHD, we're going to hand it to them with everything done correctly." Bub went to his lieutenant in the Van Nuys division and briefed him on the investigation. Outside of Bub and the 3 men in his unit, The lieutenant was the first person in the department to learn that an LAPD detective had become a cold case murder suspect. The captain of the Van Nuys division and his commanding officer, the chief of the Valley Bureau, were quickly brought into the loop. We explained that this could still turn out not to be her, Bub says. There were some coincidences, but there was nothing definitive for us at this point. The chief decided that Bub's unit could hang on to the case until the DNA sample was obtained. Back at the squad room, the detectives prepared for two possible outcomes. If Lazarus's DNA matched the sample from the swab, RHD would assume responsibility for the case. If it didn't match, the Rasmussen case would be designated, investigation continued, and shelved yet again, probably forever. On May 19, 2009, the Van Nuys detectives met off-site with detectives from the LAPD's Professional Standards Bureau, a surveillance unit directly under the command of the chief of police, who was then William Bratton. On May 27, after a week of preparation and surveillance, plainclothes detectives surreptitiously trailed Lazarus as she ran errands. When she threw out a cup and straw she had been drinking from, the surveillance team swooped in and retrieved it from the trash. At the Scientific Investigation Division, a DNA profile was quickly developed from the saliva on the straw and compared with the unidentified profile extracted from the bite mark swab. On May 29, Bub was on a day off when his cell phone rang. The call was from a technician at the crime lab. Bub recalls, it was one of those gut-wrenching moments when he said, "Yes, it's a match. Stephanie Lazarus. I wish I had been recording this because now it sounds like, you're telling me these people say I'm fighting with her. And now it sounds like you're trying to, I've been doing this a long time. Detective Jaramillo, yeah. Detective Stearns, we know. Stephanie Lazarus. Okay? And now it almost sounds like you're trying to pin something on me." The art theft detail where Lazarus worked was on the 3rd floor of Parker Center, just across the hall from the Robbery Homicide Division squad room. Lazarus was friendly with a number of RHD detectives, which made assigning the case a challenge. The two detectives who were ultimately chosen, Greg Stearns and Dan Jaramillo, were selected in part because they did not know Lazarus well and had no bias for or against her. Bub says maintaining the secrecy of the investigation was a top priority. Detectives are gossipy, he explains. That's the nature of being a detective. We all want to know. Within hours of receiving the DNA results, Bub and Nuttall brought the 4 binders that comprised the Rasmussen case file to Stearns and Jaramillo at Parker Center. We're giving them the spiel of where we are and how we got here, what's been going on for 23 years, Nuttall recalls. Dan and Greg aren't asking questions yet, because they're still absorbing this information that's just overwhelming. When they finished, all 4 detectives went straight from RHD to the DA's office, where Bub and Nuttall briefed the prosecutors who would be handling the case. To maintain secrecy, Stearns, Jaramillo, and Nuttall spent the next week working out of a conference room at the DA's office. While Stearns and Jaramillo began planning their strategy for interviewing Lazarus, Nuttall and Lisa Sanchez, another RHD detective, flew to Arizona to meet with the Rasmussen family. Because many more people within the LAPD and the DA's office were now aware of where the investigation was headed, concern was growing that word could leak at any moment. Nuttall and Sanchez were tasked with getting on-the-record statements from the Rasmussens and updating them on the investigation, without tipping them off to just how close the police were to making an arrest. Despite his many phone conversations with Nels, Nuttall had never met the Rasmussens in person, and he was nervous about the encounter. The night before and all through the morning, he went over in his head exactly what he was going to say to them. The hardest part was, I thought, man, Nels is going to undress this. He's going to know I know. He's not going to miss this. When the 2 LAPD detectives pulled up to the house, Nels came out to the driveway to greet them. The whole family was waiting inside. He walks me in, Nuttall recalls, and I drew a blank on what I was going to say. The awkward silence was broken when Loretta crossed the room to where Nuttall stood and hugged him. Here's this woman who never said 2 words to me, Nuttall says. She just walked across the room and she gave me a hug. Before the detectives left, Nuttall made one last plea for the family's patience. The detectives returned to Los Angeles and dove back into the case with Stearns and Jaramillo. One of the thorny issues still to be resolved was how and where to confront Lazarus. Chief Bratton didn't want anybody approaching her when she had a gun or access to a gun. Nuttall explains. There was no way anybody was going to sign off on us going into the house with a search warrant in the middle of the night and it may be ending in tragedy. In the end, they decided to stage the interview at Parker Center's jail division, located on the floor directly below the robbery-homicide division and the art theft detail. Firearms were not allowed in the jail, so it would not seem unnatural for all three detectives, Stearns, Jaramillo, and Lazarus, to surrender their guns before entering. The plan was for the RHD detectives to request Lazarus's help interviewing a jailed suspect who claimed to have information on an art theft case. When she arrived at the interrogation room, one equipped with recording equipment to videotape the interview, they would shift gears and gradually turn to the Rasmussen case. Given how many suspects Lazarus had arrested herself over the years, she was undoubtedly well aware of her rights to silence and to legal counsel. The unknown factor was how long she would wait before invoking one or both. Everything I knew about Stephanie. She was sharp, Nuttall says. Stearns and Jaramillo's goal would be to keep her talking as long as possible, while simultaneously assuring her that she was free to leave at any time. She would be, but only technically, as Stearns and Jaramillo would know, but Lazarus could hardly suspect. The moment she ended the interview and walked out of the room, she would be arrested regardless of what she had told them. The interview was scheduled for early in the workday on Friday, June 5th. Chief Bratton wanted the Rasmussen family informed of the arrest in person as soon as it happened, so they didn't hear about it through the media. Nuttall was tapped for the job. He called the Rasmussens and said he was coming back and would need to see them again on Friday morning. Nels replied that he had a doctor's appointment. Nuttall recalls, I said, Nels, if you can reschedule it, you may want to reschedule. At 6:40 a.m. on June 5, 2009, Jaramillo stopped by Lazarus's desk. He was wearing a wire. Stephanie, he asked, do you know me? I'm Dan Jaramillo. I work over here on the other side. He explained that he was working on a case and had a suspect in the jail who was talking about stolen art. I don't know a lot about this stuff, he told Lazarus. You can kind of talk to him. You can see if he's for real. Sure, she said. Just for like 5 minutes or something, Jaramillo added. When Lazarus arrived in the interrogation room, Stearns and Jaramillo abandoned the story of a suspect talking about stolen art and explained that her name had come up in a case involving an ex-boyfriend of hers, John Rutan. Knowing she was married to someone else, they told her they'd selected a place where they could speak privately, away from gossiping colleagues. Stearns and Jaramillo interviewed Lazarus for more than an hour, coming at her in an oblique manner that left it unclear whether they were speaking with her as a possible witness or a criminal suspect. The conversation meandered, but every digression led back, inevitably, to the murder of Sherry Rasmussen. It was only after Jaramillo asked Lazarus if she'd be willing to give them a DNA swab and noted, it's possible we may have some DNA at the location, that she said she wanted to contact a lawyer. Declaring herself shocked, the veteran detective stood and walked out, 68 minutes after she'd sat down. Lazarus got only as far as the jail's hallway, where she was stopped by other RHD detectives and placed in handcuffs. Unidentified speaker. Too tight? Which one? Left or right? Stephanie Lazarus. It's the left, but that's, I think it's just hitting my watch. Unidentified speaker. Yeah. You want me to take your watch off? They're gonna take it off anyway. Property bag? Stephanie Lazarus. Well, just... Detective Stearns. Yeah, just put it in here. Go ahead and grab her ring, too. Want to stand up for just a second? Stephanie Lazarus. Oh, geez. See if I can get it off. Detective Stearns. Okay. Stephanie Lazarus. I'm gonna probably have to lick my finger. I need a little spit. Lazarus and the detectives discuss other topics for a while. A torn ACL she suffered playing basketball, medication she needs to take every morning, before returning to the ring. Unidentified speaker. They still have your property over there if you want to take your ring off. Saliva works wonders. Stephanie Lazarus. Yeah. From the interrogation room, Lazarus was taken to Linwood, the Los Angeles County Jail facility for female prisoners, where she has been held ever since on $10 million bail. On June 8, 2009, she was charged with the murder of Sherry Rasmussen. Since her arrest, Lazarus has steadfastly maintained her innocence. Through her lawyer, she declined the Atlantic's interview request. Her trial is tentatively scheduled to begin in late August. Story number 12. The postman only rang once. Curtis Green was at home, greeting the morning with 64 ounces of Coca-Cola and powdered mini donuts. Fingers frosted synthetic white, he was startled to hear someone at the door. It was 11 a.m., and surprise visits were uncommon at his modest house in Spanish Fork, Utah, a high desert hamlet in the shadow of the Wasatch Mountains. Green ambled over, adjusting his camouflage fanny pack. At 47 his body was already failing him. He was overweight, with 4 herniated discs, a bum knee, and gleaming white dental implants. To get around, he sometimes borrowed his wife's pink cane. Green waddled to the door, his 2 chihuahuas, Max and Sammy, following attentively. He peeked through the front window and caught a glimpse of the postman hurrying off. The guy was wearing a U.S. Postal Service jacket, but with sneakers and jeans. Weird, Green thought. Also odd was a van Green noticed across the street. One he'd never seen before, white with no logos or rear windows. Green opened the door. It was winter, a day of high clouds and low sun. A pale haze washed out the white-tipped Spanish Fork Peak rising above the valley. Green looked down. On the porch sat a priority box about Bible-sized. His little dogs watched him pick up the mystery package. It was heavy, had no return address, and bore a postmark from Maryland. Green considered the package and then took it into his kitchen, where he tore it open with scissors, sending up a plume of white powder that covered his face and numbed his tongue. Just then the front door burst open, knocked off its hinges by a SWAT team wielding a battering ram. Quickly the house was flooded by cops in riot gear and black masks, weapons at the ready. There was Green, covered in cocaine and flanked by 2 chihuahuas. On the floor, someone yelled. Green dropped the package where he stood. When he tried to comfort his pups, a dozen guns took aim. "Keep your hands where we can see them." Officers cuffed Green on the floor while fending off Max, the older chihuahua, who bared his tiny fangs and bit at their shoelaces. Splayed out on the carpet, Green was eye level with dozens of boots. A large tactical team, SWAT and DA agents, fanned out through the house. He could hear things crashing, some officers yelling, others whispering to each other. He looked at the busted door and thought, man, that thing was unlocked. On the living room wall hung family photos. His wife, Tanya, their 2 daughters and a grandson. Smiling brightly above Green, lying amid $27,000 worth of premium flake. The package was stamped with a red dragon, the symbol for high-quality Peruvian. Over the whole scene was a needlepoint that said, "If I had known you were coming, I would have cleaned up." Excited by the company, little Max stopped shaking just long enough to crap right in the living room. The fact was, Green wasn't just your average Mormon grandpa. Over the past few months, he had been handling customer service for the massive online enterprise called Silk Road. It was like a clandestine eBay, a digital marketplace for illicit trade, mostly drugs. Green, under the handle chronic pain, had parlayed his extensive personal narcotics knowledge. He'd been on pain meds for years, into a paying gig working for the site. Silk Road was hidden in the so-called dark web, a part of the internet that's invisible to search engines like Google. To access Silk Road, you needed special cryptographic software. Combining an anonymous interface with traceless payments in the digital currency Bitcoin, the site allowed thousands of drug dealers and nearly 1 million eager worldwide customers to find each other and their drugs of choice in the familiar realm of e-commerce. For a brief time, from 2011 to 2013, it was a wild success. In that relatively short span, Silk Road managed to rack up, depending on how you count, more than $1 billion in sales. Which is why Green found himself surrounded by an interagency task force. He had been hired by Dread Pirate Roberts, the mysterious figure at the center of Silk Road. DPR, as he was often called, was the proprietor of the site and the visionary leader of its growing community. His relatively frictionless drug market was a serious challenge to law enforcement, who still had no idea who he or she was, or even if DPR was a single person at all. For over a year, agents from the DEA, the FBI, Homeland Security, The IRS, the Secret Service, and U.S. Postal Inspection had been trying to infiltrate the organization's inner circle. This bust of Green and his chihuahuas in the frozen Utah desert was their first notable success. The feds got Green on his feet. They had a lot of questions, starting with why he had $23,000 cash in his fanny pack and who was on the other end of the encrypted chat dialogues on his computer. Green said, improbably, that the money was his tax return. He also asked for his pain medication. Instead, they escorted him to the door and into a squad car, informing him that he'd be booked for possession of 1,092 grams of cocaine with intent to distribute. "Don't take me to jail," Green pleaded. "He knows everything about me." Later, under interrogation, Green told the skeptical agents that to charge him and make his name public was a potential death sentence. "Dread Pirate Roberts was dangerous," he said. "This guy's got millions. He could have me killed." Ross Ulbricht was deep into his regular drum circle when he spotted her. As Ross slapped the hide on his gem, a West African drum, Julia Vai sat across the circle. She had a head full of curls, light brown skin, and dark brown eyes. The drum circle was assembled on a lawn at Penn State, where in 2008 Ross was working toward a master's degree in material science and engineering. Julia was 18, a free-spirited freshman, and when she noticed Ross, she felt a powerful attraction. Not long after, Julia visited Ross' campus office, where they couldn't help but kiss and fall into a carnal heap on the floor. Both were smitten. Ross studied crystallography, working on thin film growth. One day he made a large, flat blue crystal, affixed it to a ring, and gave it to Julia. She had no idea how her boyfriend could make a crystal, but she knew she was in love. Ross had grown up in Austin, Texas, and had always been smart and charming. He'd been the kind of kid who was an Eagle Scout and let his friends give him a mohawk on a whim. He was raised in a tight family. They'd spend summers in Costa Rica. Ross' parents had built a series of rustic, solar-powered bamboo houses there, near an isolated Point Break where Ross learned to surf. In high school, Rossman, as friends called him, drove an old Volvo, smoked plenty of pot, and still got a 1460 on his SATs. To friends, Ross was carefree but also caring. Ross earned a scholarship to the University of Texas at Dallas and majored in physics. From there, he landed a graduate scholarship at Penn State, where he excelled as usual. But he wasn't happy with the drudgery of lab research. Since college, he'd been exploring psychedelics and reading Eastern philosophy. At Penn State, Ross talked openly about switching fields. He posted online about his disenchantment with science and his new interest in economics. He'd come to see taxation and government as a form of coercion, enforced by the state's monopoly on violence. His thinking was heavily influenced by Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, a totem of the modern American libertarian orthodoxy. According to von Mises, a citizen must have economic freedom to be politically or morally free. And Ross wanted to be free. When he finished his master's in 2009, he moved back to Austin and bought Julia a plane ticket to join him. She left school and they got a cheap apartment together. It was cramped, but they were young and dreamy. Both imagined they might get married. Ross tried day trading, but it didn't go well. He started a video game company. That failed too. The setbacks were devastating. He didn't want to be trying, he wanted to be doing. During this time, his downstairs neighbor, Donnie Pomertree, invited Ross to work with him on Good Wagon Books, a business that collected used books and sold them in digital storefronts like Amazon and Books A Million. Ross built Good Wagon's website, learned inventory management, and wrote a custom script that determined a book's price based on its Amazon ranking. In his spare time, Ross read, hiked, improved his yoga, and, as Julia fondly recalls, had lots and lots of great sex. But they also argued about politics. She was a Democrat, money, what he called frugal, she called cheap, and their social life, she partied more than he did. Their relationship turned stormy, with frequent breakups. In the summer of 2010, they split up yet again. He was heartbroken, later telling a woman he met on OkCupid how he'd recently been in love and was trying to get over it. Ross was adrift. "I went through a lot over the year in my personal relationships." He wrote in a journal on his computer, a kind of self-assessment of life goals. I had left my promising career as a scientist to be an investment advisor and entrepreneur, and came up empty-handed. Ross felt ashamed, but not long afterward Pomertree got a job in Dallas, leaving Goodwagon to Ross. For years, all he'd wanted was to be in charge of something. Now he was. In the Goodwagon warehouse, Ross oversaw 5 part-time college students sorting, logging, and organizing the 50,000 books on shelves he built himself. That December was Goodwagon's best month, clearing 10 grand. But by the end of 2010, the new CEO of Goodwagon was looking beyond the book business. During his forays into trading, Ross had discovered Bitcoin, the digital cryptocurrency. The value of Bitcoin, based only on market factors, unattached to any central bank, aligned with his advancing libertarian philosophy. On his LinkedIn page, Ross wrote that he wanted to use economic theory as a means to abolish the use of coercion and aggression amongst mankind. To that end, Ross had a flash of insight. The idea, he wrote in his journal, was to create a website where people could buy anything anonymously, with no trail whatsoever that could lead back to them. He wrote that he'd been studying the technology for a while but needed a business model and strategy. Like most libertarians, Ross believed that drug use was a personal choice. And like all people paying attention, he observed that the war on drugs was a complete failure. The natural merchandise for his new enterprise would be drugs. I was calling it underground brokers, Ross wrote, but eventually settled on Silk Road. Ever the capable scientist, Ross decided to cultivate his own psilocybin mushrooms as a starter product. He was spending time with Julia again, while struggling with programming his site and still running Goodwagon. Then, one night in early 2011, Goodwagon collapsed. In the literal sense, Ross was working late, alone in the warehouse, when he heard an enormous crash, the sound of the library falling apart. He'd carefully designed the entire system but had somehow forgotten 2 vital screws, the ones that held it all together. The shelves came down, every single one, like dominoes. When Ross broke the news to Pomertree, he also admitted that his heart wasn't in Goodwagon anymore. They agreed to close the company with no hard feelings. He told Pomertree that he already had a new business idea, something really big. Silk Road went live in mid-January 2011. A few days later came the first sale. Then more. Ross eventually sold all 10 pounds of his mushrooms, but other vendors started joining. He was handling all the transactions by hand, which was time-consuming but exhilarating. It wasn't long before enough vendors and users made it a functioning, growing marketplace. Just before the launch, facing a new year and a blank slate, Ross had resolved to change his life. In 2011, he wrote to himself, "I am creating a year of prosperity and power beyond what I have ever experienced before. Silk Road is going to become a phenomenon, and at least one person will tell me about it." Unknowing that I was its creator, Special Agent Carl Mark Force 4 was half asleep when the postal inspector started talking about something weird in the parcel sorters. "Just want to let everybody know about this," the inspector said, delivering his brief to a conference room full of bored law enforcement personnel. "We are having problems with drugs coming through the mail." Force was a Baltimore-based DEA agent, and he was at a regional interagency meeting, a periodic intel show and tell with analysts from the FBI, the DEA, the IRS, and Homeland Security. "It's coming from an underground drug site," the inspector said, "called Silk Road." Force sat up. This was the kind of thing he was looking for. He had burned out on the grind of arresting street dealers. At 6 feet and 200 pounds, Force was an athletic guy, and coming up through the agency he'd loved the physical thrill of bursting through a door at 6 a.m. in Doc Martens in a tactical vest, clearing some broke-down row house on some broke-down block and catching some dealer in the bathroom, cuffing the guy before he could wipe his ass. But after countless raids, the adrenaline had worn off. And in the grand scheme of things, who cared about confiscating a few grams? He was pushing 50 and still on the federal payroll in a regional office. That's when you want to find a big case and get out. And so he went looking for leads in meetings like this, which were mostly yawners until now. By the time Force heard about Silk Road, it had been around nearly a year. The site was modeled sensibly on Amazon and eBay. And that's what it looked like. A well-organized community marketplace, complete with profiles, listings, and transaction reviews. Everything was anonymous, and shipments often went through the regular old postal service. No need for fake names, you put your real address, and if anyone asks, you just say you didn't order all that heroin. Silk Road's seller's guide had helpful instructions on how to vacuum seal or otherwise hide drugs to evade electronic sensors or canine olfactories. Most shipments made it to happy customers. That the small percentage of intercepted Silk Road packages represented an uptick spoke to the quickly rising volume of the site's trade. A vast pharmacopoeia covering dozens of categories with 13,000 listings. It was a colorful smorgasbord for every type of connoisseur. Fish scale Colombian cocaine, Afghan No. 4 heroin, strawberry LSD, Carmelo hash, Mercury's famous uncut cocaine flakes, Mario Invincibility Star XTC, white Mitsubishi MDMA, a black tar heroin called the Devil's Licorice. Then there were the prescription meds, everything from OxyContin and Xanax to fentanyl and Dilaudid. Silk Road's product descriptions and user ratings amounted to an encyclopedic information source. Can't Feel Me Face said one product has a nice shine and provides a rush of euphoria and confidence. Ivory's review of some crystal MDMA observed that it had a nice fizz and wisp of smoke, smiley face. The reviews and community standards enforced excellent value and customer service on Silk Road, which brought more users, increasing its reputation further, until Silk Road became the premier destination for digital drug sales. Law enforcement was caught with its tactical pants down. Various agencies had sniffed around Silk Road in the summer of 2011 but gotten nowhere. Force saw potential but didn't even know where to begin. Months later, in January 2012, he got some good news from his supervisor. Homeland Security was assembling a task force for a full-on Silk Road case. "You want in?" his boss asked. Before he knew it, Force was at a Silk Road summit, where he and 40 other agents picked through donut boxes and watched PowerPoint presentations filled with technical information about nodes and TCP/IP layers. Most of the agents' eyes glazed over, but yes, Force wanted in. The task force that formed to take on Silk Road Operation Marco Polo was based out of the Baltimore Homeland Security Investigations Office. Another agent showed Force how to navigate Silk Road. He quickly saw that it had a vocal mastermind, the revered figure known as Dread Pirate Roberts. It was a clever touch, borrowing the name from The Princess Bride, in which the pirate was a mythical character, inhabited by the wearer of the mask. The idea of a malleable but enduring identity only added to Silk Road's enigmatic appeal. Force was intrigued. Whoever wore this digital mask sat atop a burgeoning empire. Force told his boss that Silk Road was a target of opportunity, but he was unskilled at computers and he didn't know anything about Bitcoin. So he decided to learn. Hector Xavier Monsegur was an unusual visitor to the New York FBI office. Then again, Monsegur was not really a visitor. It was past 1 a.m. one night in the spring of 2011, and he was being led to the back of the empty bullpen by Chris Tarbell, a young agent who had arrested Monsegur earlier that night in the Jacob Riis houses on the Lower East Side. Monsegur was an enormous Puerto Rican, ears studded with diamonds, who grew up in the projects. He was also Sabu, a co-founder of Lulz SEC, the elite group of hackers responsible for electronically attacking dozens of corporate and government targets like News Corporation and the CIA. Sabu was the most high-profile member of Anonymous, the hacktivist political collective. Tarbell had managed to follow a blind lead from the FBI's public hotline to Sabu and reel him into the FBI as an informant. It was a remarkable score for Tarbell, especially since he was still a rookie. Tarbell had always had the cop in him, even when his parents thought he was going to be a doctor. In college, he was a powerlifter, an unusual sight at James Madison University, a preppy school in the Shenandoah Valley. He already looked like a cop, big, with a short coif on top of that baby face. By the time Tarbell finished college, he sensed where policing was headed and got a master's in computer science. He didn't understand programming at first, but he did understand that this was the future, so he paced himself, stuck with it, and came out the other side as a computer forensics expert, working as a civilian for the FBI. Tarbell spent 4 years traveling the world with global forensics, tracking down terrorists, child pornographers, and botnets. He showed a talent for uncovering digital trails. He thought about how the virtual realm seemed like magic, a secret world, poorly understood. And like all magical realms, it was full of charlatans and practitioners of dark arts. Few could decipher those secrets, and Tarbell liked being one of them. After a few years in forensics, Tarbell told his wife, Sabrina, he wanted to officially join the bureau. Sabrina, 8 months pregnant, approved, even though it meant uprooting their lives. After Quantico, Tarbell was assigned to the New York office, home to the FBI's nascent cybercrime division. By this time he was 31, a little old to be the new guy. But catching the elusive Sabu made Tarbell's name at the bureau. Online, Sabu's credibility among hackers was unassailable. The FBI set him up with a new laptop in their office, where he gathered evidence against his Lulz SEC friends. 9 months later, dozens of arrests were made, severely disabling 2 of the world's biggest hacker groups. After Lulz SEC, Tarbell looked for a new big case. He took an interest in Tor, the encryption software that allowed users to visit sites such as Silk Road. Tor's protocol is a kind of digital invisibility cloak, hiding users and the sites they visit. Tor stands for the Onion Router and was launched by the Navy in 2002. It has since become a tool for all manner of clandestine communications, licit and illicit, from circumventing censorship in countries like China to powering contraband sites like Silk Road. Tor's encryption is so layered, agents thought it was unbreakable. When cybercrime investigations hit a Tor IP, they would give up. The supposed impossibility only attracted Tarbell. I'm going to take on Tor, he thought. Tarbell briefed his supervisor, who briefed his supervisor, and so on, until they wound up in the office of the SAC, or special agent in charge. Above the SAC is the assistant director in charge. Yes, an endless source of amusement when complaining about red tape in the FBI is to talk about how the SAC is just below ADIC. It took a couple of sales pitches to soften up the SAC, but in February 2013, Tarbell opened the FBI's first Tor case. Operation Onion Peeler. By now, Silk Road was a juicy target. Many agencies were working on it, but with no success. Homeland Security Investigations had a case open. The IRS had looked into it. There was Force's DEA case in Baltimore, and the New York DEA, which asked Tarbell for technical advice. They were using traditional drug investigation techniques, but Tarbell knew this wasn't an operation where you could flip people up the chain because there was no chain. You had to go straight to the top. Ross was paddling through the break, lining up for a set. The beach at Bondi, just south of Sydney, sloped down to a gorgeous waterline. For Ross, the waves were among the many advantages of leaving Austin in late 2011 to spend some time in Australia with his older sister, Callie. He quickly made friends there, a lively group that went out drinking, invited him to warehouse parties, and met up to go surfing. Ross had worked that morning but was in the water by afternoon. It was nice, the portable life, and it was made possible by his flourishing online drug bazaar. Silk Road's usage had exploded in June of that year, after a story on Gawker brought the site mainstream attention. After that, traffic grew so fast that Ross needed technical support to maintain the site, deal with transactions, and add features like automatic payments and a better feedback system. He'd been doing it all himself, learning on the fly, programming automated transactions, and using CodeIgniter to write and rewrite the site after a benevolent hacker alerted him to some major flaws. "This is amateur shit," the hacker had said. His homespun efforts worked, miraculously, but Ross lost sleep over it. To outsiders he seemed his normal genial self, but in his digital domain he was frazzled, trying to keep Silk Road running. All the while he recorded in his journal the pitfalls of running a seat-of-the-pants startup. And yeah, that was yet another learning curve, configuring and running a LAMP server. Oh joy! But I was loving it. Sure, it was a little crude, but it worked. Rewriting the site was the most stressful couple of months I've ever experienced. Early on, Ross had turned to Richard Bates, a college friend who was now a software engineer in Austin. Bates helped Ross with basic programming and tended to crises like the site's first major outage. When Silk Road took off, Ross tried to hire Bates, but Bates already had a programming job. "Have you ever thought about doing something legitimate?" Bates asked Ross. "Something legal?" Ross wasn't really interested. Driven by the failure of his previous businesses, he was determined to make Silk Road succeed. He disappeared into his work and started professionalizing his organization. He and Julia broke up again that summer. With Silk Road in his computer, there was little to keep Ross in Austin. By the time he got to Australia, he had banked $100,000 and was earning $25,000 a month in commissions. It was time to bring in some hired guns, he wrote, to take the site to the next level. Part of the problem was that Ross was grappling with what hackers call operational security, or OPSEC. To completely seal his two identities from one another, Ross realized, would require a kind of ruthless and elaborate secrecy. He appealed to Bates to stay quiet. Later, Ross told his friend that he'd sold Silk Road to a mysterious buyer. He also struggled with learning how to lie. Just before New Year's, he went on a date with a woman named Jessica. He told her, like everyone else, that he was working on a Bitcoin exchange. This alone constituted a security leak. I'm so stupid, he thought. But Ross got deep with Jessica and felt an urge to reveal himself. He lamented this feeling, the divide between intimacy and deceit. The Eagle Scout in him agonized over telling half-truths. Sitting across from Jessica, he wished he could be honest. He also wished he'd started with a better lie. But Ross did divulge the most important truth. He told her, I have secrets. When Silk Road started, its leader was something of a cipher. Users and vendors only knew that there was a system administrator who'd established the site's conceptual framework as both a drug marketplace and libertarian experiment. There was a basic ethics for that experiment. Some of Silk Road's users were purists who advocated for full transactional autonomy. If heroin, why not howitzers and human hearts? But the administrator pronounced a strict code of conduct: no child porn, stolen goods, or fake degrees. He summed it up like so: our basic rules are to treat others as you would wish to be treated, and don't do anything to hurt or scam someone else. As time went on, the administrator became an important voice, the site's theorist and advocate for individual liberty. But ideas need a true leader. This role, Ross decided, was too important to go unnamed. Who is Silk Road? Posted the administrator in February 2012 to the community. I am Silk Road, the market, the person, the enterprise, everything. I need a name. Drum roll, please. Came the dramatic announcement. My new name is Dread Pirate Roberts. Everyone loves The Princess Bride, and the reference was clear immediately. Force and Tarbell, who had both seen the movie many times, got the implication as well: plausible deniability. The mask, worn by successive generations of pirates, obfuscates the relationship between the name and the man. The christening of DPR was emblematic of Silk Road's secrecy. It also ignited a true cult of personality. DPR was thoughtful and at times eloquent. For believers, Silk Road was more than a black market. It was a sanctuary. For DPR, the site was a political polemic in practice. Stop funding the state with your tax dollars, DPR wrote, and direct your productive energies into the black market. DPR got more grandiose over time, writing that every transaction on Silk Road was a step toward universal freedom. In a way, Silk Road was the logical extension of the libertarian view that animates much of the internet, not to mention the rising political tide in Washington. It was Silicon Valley in extremis, a disruptive technology wrapped in political rhetoric. DPR was its philosopher king, envisioning a post-state digital economy, with Silk Road as the first step toward a libertarian paradise. Not only was Silk Road a slap in the face to law enforcement, it was a direct challenge, as DPR wrote, to the very structure of power. All the more reason, of course, why the government wanted to shut it down. Ross had been flattered by the sudden media attention in June 2011, but when U.S. Senator Charles Schumer called a press conference to denounce Silk Road, he was alarmed. The U.S. government, my main enemy, he wrote, was aware of me and calling for my destruction. April 2012. Knob Business Proposal. Mr. Silk Road, I am a great admirer of your work. Brilliant, utterly brilliant. I will keep this short and to the point. I want to buy the site. I've been in the business for over 20 years. Silk Road is the future of trafficking. Sincerely, he. Force wrote this message from one of 2 government laptops he was issued for his undercover mission on Silk Road. They were Dell's, silver and clunky with shitty batteries, so the DA agent had to keep them plugged in, usually in the seclusion of the guest room of his house in the Baltimore suburbs. That was also the favorite room of Pablo, Force's cat, who would sit on the bed watching him, in his chair and ottoman, as he took to the keys posing as a high-rolling international drug smuggler. He had constructed an elaborate identity. Eladio Guzman, a cartel operative based in the Dominican Republic whose bread and butter was moving mid-sized shipments of heroin and cocaine. For Guzman's Silk Road screen name, Force chose Nob, after the biblical city where David obtains the sword of Goliath. Oh, and the Guzman character was blind in one eye. So Force put on a hoodie and an eye patch and had his 10-year-old daughter take his profile picture. In the photo, Force, aka Guzman, aka Nob, held up a sign. All hail Nob. Force knew how to put together a backstory from his years in undercover. As a young agent, he'd been on the front lines of the drug war. He grew out his hair, put bronze hoops in his ear, and inked a huge tribal piece on his back. He said he worked in construction while looking for leads in down-and-out bars, like the Purple Pig Pub in Alamosa, Colorado, the gateway to the Great Sand Dunes, and also the gateway to the Rocky Mountain route for Mexican meth. Putting himself in the mindset of a smuggler, Force saw Silk Road's strength as communications and distribution. Hence his big opening gambit. For Guzman, Silk Road offered the opportunity for covert vertical integration from wholesale to retail. Force hoped he'd get a quick response, and he did. The day after Nob's proposal, Dread Pirate Roberts wrote, "I'm open to the idea. What did you have in mind?" Tarbell was at work, on the 23rd floor of the New York FBI office, early as usual. He was the kind of guy who wanted to be first in the office. Always had been, ever since college, when he started organizing his whole life on spreadsheets. Tarbell and Sabrina's first date is still on an Excel worksheet somewhere, as is everything that's happened since. Calendar, bills, weight goals, daily run. Tarbell's father-in-law, a longtime Marine, thought Tarbell was the most regimented person he'd ever met. Tarbell set his alarm for 4:30 a.m., hit the gym by 5, and was showered and seated at his desk by 7 a.m. sharp. Tarbell and his fellow cybercops occupied a couple of dozen spots toward the back of the bullpen, fanned out around a core group of desks called the Pit. This was prime real estate where the cool kids among the FBI's computer clique sat. When Tarbell started, he was sitting 2 desks and an aisle away, way over by the windows. But during the lulls SEC investigation, a coveted desk opened up and he leapfrogged right into the center of the Pit. Tarbell liked his new colleagues, especially Ilwin Yum. As a kid, Yum moved from Korea to Long Island, where he got into video games and later learned about networking and packets from playing competitively in college. Yum would become vital to the Silk Road case because he was the squad's Bitcoin specialist. He'd gone to the first Bitcoin conference in August 2011 in New York. From a law enforcement perspective, Bitcoin screamed money laundering. But technologically, Yum thought the protocol was simply beautiful. Across from Yum was Tom Kiernan. He'd been in the Pit the longest, 17 years, nearly since the DOS era, when he started at the bureau as a civilian tech support guy, responding when agents' printers stopped working. Kiernan just understood machines backward and forward, and became the spine of the cyber squad. He'd seen every case and knew all, like the Pit's very own Oracle. Just the guy Tarbell needed to help probe Silk Road's defenses. Tor was a vexing problem. Tarbell thought it had benefits, but he also believed that all technologies could have their purposes corrupted. In a criminal context, as with Silk Road, Tor made classic law enforcement, knocking on doors, interviewing witnesses, making deals, nearly useless. Sure, you might start to piece together the network or get closer to DPR, but you'd still have only usernames. This was not a people case, Tarbell thought. This was a computer case. The path to DPR was through his server. Finding it was a fearsome technical challenge. Out of 1.5 billion computers in the world, Tarbell started to think about just one machine day after day. Could be anywhere. He was looking for a nanowire in a haystack. Back in Baltimore, Force was fluffing pillows. This was his habit in the evening, a way to clear his mind before getting on Silk Road as Nob. For the first couple of weeks, Nob pushed his big Silk Road investment scheme. But DPR declined, saying essentially, "This operation is bigger than you think." And it was because Silk Road worked extremely well. DPR's robust stewardship was paying off. To protect against scammers, he created a Silk Road escrow, where all transactions would be held until settled. DPR wanted to create what he called a center of trust, And it was this centralized payment structure that enabled Silk Road to really take off. So when Knob offered to buy the operation, DPR countered with quite a price. $1 billion. Knob scoffed. But in fact, DPR's number might have been low. The scale of Silk Road commissions over the next year would in fact qualify DPR as one of the biggest entrepreneurs of the second internet boom. Besides, he told Knob, "This is more than a business to me. It's a revolution and is becoming my life's work." In essence, DPR faced a classic founder's dilemma. It would not be easy to pass the baton without hurting the enterprise, he messaged Knob. And right now that is more important to me than the money. Force kept communication with DPR alive by talking about creating a parallel site for cartels, a pro version called Masters of Silk Road. He spent many nights in his guest room, Pablo purring by his side, forging a camaraderie with DPR through the intimacy of late-night tour chat. At times they sounded like college kids getting to know each other in the freshman dorm. "The food pyramid is bullshit," DPR said, encouraging Knob to go paleo. Knob advised DPR against seeing the latest Batman, invited him to LA for tacos, and talked about how much Latinos like the Smiths. DPR had never heard of the Smiths, but otherwise, Force's mysterious new pen pal was appropriately cagey. He didn't want to meet up for tacos. For some reason, Force always imagined DPR as a skinny white kid, probably on the West Coast based on his active hours. Force liked him, this kid he had in mind as DPR. He enjoyed getting deep into the culture of Silk Road. It reminded him of his undercover days. He thought about DPR living a double life and the allure and danger of taking on a new identity. Force had seen it firsthand in his years in undercover. He came to love being that criminal operator big shot. But a new self comes with a price. The more Force pretended and partied, the easier it was to inhabit the part. At home he was the clean-cut, church-going dad. But when he was at some nightclub hunting for drug deals, liquor flowing, surrounded by girls, it was hard to believe just how comfortable he felt. Eventually Force stopped drinking and recommitted himself to church. He'd been a hot undercover agent, but he left behind the double life that nearly destroyed him. That's how he wound up in the Baltimore office, living in a suburban two-story with a big, solid oak tree in the backyard. But now here he was, within sight of that oak, his family in the next room, venturing again into the drug world as someone else. Force recognized it was all a dangerous game. He knew how you could change. He could see it in DPR already. The thing about taking on a new identity is that it is fundamentally a lie. To the world at first, and then to yourself. The world is in flux, Ross tells the camera. He sits across from his friend Renee Pinnell, recording for StoryCorps, a nonprofit that invites anyone to share their life experiences. Ross and Renee thought the world should know more about them, so they entered the StoryCorps booth, closed the door, and spent half an hour with each other and the camera. In this recording, Ross is contemplative. He lives in San Francisco now. It has been a revelation. He is awed by the beauty and the entrepreneurial energy. He came at the invitation of Renee, whom he'd known since 7th grade. Renee had been an aspiring filmmaker who instead wound up in technology in San Francisco, and one day he phoned Ross, intoning the great American clarion call of opportunity out west. 2 weeks later, Ross showed up on his friend's doorstep. In the video, they get nostalgic about childhood. There was the time the two of them tried to steal extra tater tots in the lunchroom at West Ridge Middle School. The way Ross would eat his peanut butter chocolate wafers precisely by nibbling down the layers. How uncool it was when Ross had a sleepover and some bad kids stole a year's worth of change he'd saved. Of course, they talk about love as young men do. Ross reminisces about Ashley, his first, and her great tits. The first time they'd hung out, they did psychedelics, something called AMT. They got it from his neighbor Brandon, a super brilliant physics student who was into all of these research chemicals. Ross was still a teenager then, lying on the floor, expanding his mind next to a beautiful girl for 8 hours. Life is a fluctuating value, Renee says, like currency. Renee thinks his friend is a trader. Renee talks about how Austin is the mecca of startups, whereas San Francisco is the mecca. It's late 2012, a time of fever dreams in the Bay Area, full of people wanting to change the world, and make a lot of money in the process. Renee may not know it, but he is sitting next to someone doing just that. Ross and Renee wonder, what will happen in 200 years? I want to have a substantial positive impact on the future of humanity by the time I die, Ross says. Renee asks Ross if he thinks he'll live forever. Ross looks up, breaks into a tiny smile. Yes, he says. I think I might. As Silk Road became a true global market, DPR reveled in his role as leader and libertarian evangelist. He created a book club where users could polish their dogma from the sacred texts of von Mises himself. He talked more about a near future when our current governments would seem like ancient history, along with the pharaohs and their armies of slaves. He extolled the Silk Road faithful for being on the front lines of revolution. Thank you, DPR said, for your trust, faith, camaraderie, and love. He offered them hugs, not drugs, then amended it, wait, hugs and drugs. The community responded in kind, likening DPR to Che Guevara, calling him a job creator, and declaring that his name would live on among the greatest men and women in history. Silk Road had become a brand cult, with tens of thousands of fanatical users, and DPR was their very own Steve Jobs. Force sensed DPR's swelling confidence. He'd been talking to him for a year, taking in DPR's personality and passion. Force could appreciate the appeal. It must be intoxicating, bringing an idea to life, projecting your will into the world through encrypted code and transactions. Sometimes DPR said that he sensed the scale of this achievement and would hear the theme to Tron playing in his head. This was the new spirit of DPR, a self-created beacon in the darkness, spreading the good word through libertarian jubilee, holding aloft his lantern of truth. It was a lonely outpost, however. DPR said so to Knob. He called himself a person who hides behind computers. At times DPR wished they could meet. Instead, they shared a mix of truth and fiction about their lives. NOB. You doing good? Dread. Yes, sir. Today is a good day. NOB. So that black cloud that was over your head has gone? Dread. The new look rolled out with minimal issues. Woke up next to a beautiful woman, and I'm listening to one of my favorite bands/songs, and eating fresh strawberries. They talked shop, site fixes, the odd holiday slump in drug sales, the human resources problems of a clandestine telecommuting workplace. This was a big problem. To grow, DPR said he had to build a strong workforce. A leader needs support so he can focus on the future. I just want to let you know that your work hasn't gone unnoticed, DPR wrote to Chronic Pain, aka Curtis Green, the Mormon grandpa in Spanish Fork, Utah. I'd like to offer you a position. Green had been on Silk Road for some time, and he'd chosen that screen name because of his own chronic pain, caused by a back injury he'd sustained while working as an EMT. On disability, Green had become an amateur pharmacologist, learning the ins and outs of opiates. Green had always been the hobbyist type, ever since his high school obsession with ham radios, which he used to talk to strangers all over the world, including astronauts on the International Space Station. Silk Road fulfilled his yearning for community and technical intricacy, combining computers with his interest in safe drug use. With DPR's approval, Green started Silk Road's Health and Wellness Forum, where he advised people on how to snort ephedrine, cautioned against fentanyl for the uninitiated, and explained to someone that it's not a good idea to inject peanut butter or shoot heroin into your eyeball. When Green's diligent forum moderating turned into a job offer from DPR, he was thrilled. DPR sent a job description, which included customer service and resetting passwords. Green, taking on a new admin handle, Flush, worked 80 hours a week, mediating drug sale disputes from his lounger, Fox News running in the background. DPR was a complicated boss. He could be a hard taskmaster, haranguing Green for being even 1 minute late to an appointed time on TourChat. Green was chagrined when he got no Christmas greeting. But other times DPR was full of generosity, staking Green in a poker tournament, and being unfazed when Green lost it all. Like a digital era Don, he could be affectionate and magnanimous in public but decidedly less humane behind the scenes. He gave audience to loyal users seeking favors. One guy got help buying a wedding ring, but was decidedly unsympathetic to the real consequences of his business. Green forwarded one troubling customer service complaint from a woman whose brother overdosed on heroin from Silk Road and noted that under the current system, children could use the site. Perhaps that was a hair too much freedom, Green said. DPR erupted. That's my whole idea. Any constraints would destroy the fundamental concept, he said, and refused any assistance for the grieving sister. And yet Green stayed on, despite the insensitivity and ethical contradictions, becoming one of Silk Road's most trusted employees. On Silk Road, however, trust only went so far. DPR demanded a scan of Green's driver's license. It was a loyalty test. Green obliged, even though it exposed him while allowing DPR to remain in the shadows. Like Force, Green felt like he'd established quite a bond with DPR partners in a secret world. But not all secrets are partnerships. No matter how close Green or Force or anyone else got to DPR, no one had any idea who he was. Tarbell had 3 computers on his desk, as did Kiernan and Yum. The Cyber Squad crew looked for any flicker of information that would crack open the dark web. But their investigation was moving slowly. They explored the site, read the forums, and crawled Reddit, looking for Silk Road community members talking to each other, or to DPR about cryptographic weaknesses they discovered. But a month went by with no traction. The crew ate lunch together every day at 11:30 on the nose like the habit-happy cops they were. Most of the time they picked up sandwiches downstairs at the deli, where the guy behind the counter knew them all by their order. Kiernan would be happy with chicken cordon bleu forever, and Tarbell was such a fan of the chicken parmesan that when he'd occasionally get a salad the deli guy would say, "Aw, what's the matter, Mr. CIA? No chicken parm today?" Tarbell called Yum his work wife. They were a good team, he thought. The thinker and the talker. Tarbell was the talker. He had by now emerged as the dominant personality in the pit. The dues-paying rookie of the previous year had given way to a raucous, confident alpha type who bristled when he heard rumblings from Washington about ownership of the Silk Road investigation. The case had become an enormous bureaucratic battle, as every agency tried to plant its flag. The Baltimore Task Force, where Force's case operated, was the most aggressive, claiming complete ownership and bad-mouthing the FBI Cyber Squad in particular. "They think we're a joke, poking around on the internet," Tarbell told Yum. "But we're going to prove them wrong." The other agencies, he noted, had been at it for a while, and they don't have fuck all. But in the bureaucratic muddle that is the United States government, there is no clear jurisdiction for cybercrime. It's a growing field that's fueling law enforcement funding, which attracts egos and politics. Silk Road represented the new frontier of crime, a digital-era Wild West. As with the original frontier, Washington wanted to fence it in, and whoever brought law to the lawless would be a hero. Subdue the digital frontier and there was a star waiting for you, which was why the Silk Road case had become the largest online manhunt in history. Green wouldn't stop talking, even covered in cocaine. That was how Force found him when the SWAT team finished ransacking his house. Force was running that show. As Knob, he'd orchestrated the shipment of coke, and the whole raid was part of the growing Marco Polo task force investigating Silk Road. He'd watched Green take the bait from a command post across the street, and when he walked in a few minutes later, Green was cuffed on the floor, blabbing already. Green had more answers than Force had questions. He talked and talked and talked until Force couldn't stand it. Said he was a former EMT, he was just trying to help people. They could have just knocked. He thought the package was something else, a totally legal drug called N-bomb. Shut the fuck up already, Force thought. Nevertheless, Green was a tangible lead in the Silk Road case, a corporeal asset rather than just letters on a screen. As Green was led to the squad car to be booked on possession by the local cops, Force put his number in Green's phone and said, "When you get out, call me." In jail, Green jawboned for hours to anyone who would listen, even declaring that he had been asked to cooperate with the DEA, at which point his tattooed cellmates told him to stop talking. When Green was released on bail, he went home and found his door still broken. His daughter had cleaned up some. In his bedroom, the cops had apparently discovered that this particular Mormon grandpa owned a dildo, which they left for him standing straight up on the bed. Home alone with his 2 chihuahuas, Green cried like a baby. "I'm a good little Mormon boy," he said to himself. His thoughts grew dark. He loaded his dad's .32. Then he looked down the barrel and threw it across the room. Green would be the first to admit that he was too chicken shit for suicide. He ran into the living room and threw himself onto the couch, where his chihuahuas joined him, licking his face while he fell to his knees to pray. Eventually Green decided to get up, get his phone, and call DEA Special Agent Carl Force. It wasn't until Force spent some time on Green's computer and saw DPR's messages. "Why aren't you clearing out your accounts? Get back to me ASAP." That he realized they caught a big fish in their net. This guy was a DPR lieutenant. Force mobilized quickly, working with the task force to put Green up in a Salt Lake City Marriott and debrief him. But DPR was jittery, and he'd noticed that his trusted admin had been offline for a few days. A Google search revealed that Green had been arrested, and DPR suspected he would flip. Moreover, he got a message from another employee, Inigo, that $350,000 in bitcoins had just disappeared from various accounts. Inigo quickly traced the theft to Green's admin identity. DPR went into crisis mode, communicating with his confidants, scrambling for a solution. "This will be the first time I have had to call on my muscle," he told Inigo. "Fucking sucks." Moments later, DPR messaged Knob that he had a problem in Utah that required violence. According to the backstory Force had created for Knob, his criminal repertoire included enforcement and collection talents, so he acted the part. Sitting in the Marriott, Force received a PDF of the target, opened it, and discovered a scan of Green's driver's license photo. Then he looked across the table, where at that very moment Green was half asleep. "Well, this sure is an opportunity," Force thought. "NOB, do you want him beat up? Shot, just paid a visit? Dread. I'd like him beat up, then forced to send the bitcoins he stole back. Dread. Not sure how these things usually go." Green claimed he hadn't stolen any bitcoins and protested that the task force had had his computer when the money went missing. But Force didn't want to talk about the money. He used DPR's request to construct an elaborate plan. "Dread. How quickly do you think you can get someone over there? And what does that cost you?" Force got Green to sign a waiver, thereby commencing his role in an impromptu staged torture sting against DPR. Soon Green was being dunked in the bathtub of a Marriott suite by phony thugs who were in fact a Secret Service agent and a Baltimore postal inspector. Force recorded the action on a camera. "Did you get it?" Green asked, wet and wheezing on the floor. He'd felt like their simulation was a little too accurate. They dunked him 4 more times to get a convincing shot. While waiting for news from Knob, DPR considered his options. A Silk Road user named Simon, a trusted advisor who had guided DPR on OPSEC, programming, and leadership, asked DPR when a transgression against Silk Road requires a lethal response. "If this was the Wild West," DPR said, "and it kinda is, you'd get hung just for stealing a horse." A few minutes later, Inigo chimed in, "I don't condone murder, but that's almost worthy of assassinating him over oil." Later that day, DPR messaged Knob. "Dread. Okay, so can you change the order to execute rather than torture? Dread. He was on the inside for a while, and now that he's been arrested, I'm afraid he'll give up info." Of course, DPR was right that Green had been flipped by the very same man he'd just hired as an assassin. It was a surprising escalation. The Silk Road leader, who waxed lyrical about respecting the Silk Road community, was now pondering pricing for murder. Dread. Never killed a man or had one killed before, but it is the right move in this case. Dread. How much will it cost? Dread. Ballpark? Dread. Less than $100,000? Dread. Have you killed or had someone killed before? It was like Scarface on Fast Forward, Force thought, but he played right along. Over a week or so, Force conspired with his team to complete the fake death of Green. Force sent DPR photos of the staged torture, followed by photos of Green, face down on the floor, pallid, smeared with Campbell's chicken and Star's soup, the supposed aftermath of asphyxiation. Green holed up in his house. He had to stay out of sight as part of the ruse, in a kind of self-imposed witness protection, and Force went back to Baltimore. DPR sent $40,000 to a Capital One account controlled by the government as an advance. DPR never got back the stolen bitcoins, but once in receipt of the putative proof of death, He sent another $40,000 for a job well done. NOB. You okay? Dread. I am pissed I had to kill him. Dread. But what's done is done. DPR had momentarily wrestled with his decision. He had talked to Inigo about how he just wishes the best for people, and loves them in the libertarian spirit, even green in flagrante delicto, but ultimately concluded that his AWOL employee had become too much of a liability. And so, DPR's principled technological stand against the war on drugs slid into murder. Like so many revolutionaries before him, the idealist became an ideologue, willing to kill for his beloved vision. At one point, DPR corrected Inigo that this action was not revenge. It was justice, a new justice according to the law of the Silk Road. Back in Baltimore, sitting in his guest room with Pablo, Force thought about DPR's shift. He wondered, what changed? DPR was asking himself the same question. Moral choices blur when your identity is shifting. This was the irony behind the very idea of the Dread Pirate Roberts moniker, an inherent danger that the wearer would become the mask. Unmoored, DPR sensed that he was in a state of becoming. NOB. What have you learned? Dread. Well, I'm also learning who I am. I don't think this will be the hardest thing I'll have to do. NOB. What could be harder? Dread. I don't know. Dread. Maybe I'll be faced with a decision where lives of innocent people will depend on the outcome. As if seeking a makeshift moral compass among murderers, DPR asked Nob to let him know if he was abusing his authority. That is what friends are for. Nob replied. DPR confided to Inigo that one of his deepest fears was being wildly successful and being corrupted by that power. Nob also warned his online comrade about that power, how it could consume you. In his office, Force himself had put up a picture of Jesus Malverde, the Mexican narco saint, as inspiration for Nob, and felt the pull of the folk hero bandit. He reminded DPR not to lose yourself. How could he not? Now astride a multimillion-dollar drug operation that he'd built in less than 2 years, Ross was no longer the tender-hearted soul who agonized over telling one lie to a young woman over a glass of wine. His diary had changed from a story about doubts and hopes to a catalog of hard-nosed empire building.